The smallest forms carry the most wonder, creatures still learning what they might become. Baby Pokemon occupy the earliest stage of evolutionary lines, introduced during the second generation to expand the depth of families already familiar to trainers. These tiny beings cannot breed, setting them apart from first stage Pokemon who possess that capability. The distinction matters in ways both mechanical and thematic, establishing a category defined by innocence and potential. And before you drift off, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this. And thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. Baby Pokemon emerged as retroactive additions, slotting beneath creatures that had existed since the beginning. Pikachu gained Pichu, Jigglypuff gained Igglybuff, and suddenly entire families felt more complete, more natural. The mechanic felt intuitive, despite being introduced years after the original designs had been established. These younger forms existed in a state before full capability, too small and inexperienced to produce offspring of their own. The limitation created a clear boundary between infancy and adolescence within the Pokemon world. From Generation 3 through Generation 8, most baby Pokemon introduced after the second generation required specific incense items during breeding. The parent Pokemon needed to hold these aromatic items for the baby form to emerge from the resulting egg. Without the proper incense, only the parent species would hatch. Meryl required the sea incense to produce Azrael eggs. Wobbuffet needed the lax incense for Wynot. The system provided an in-universe explanation for why these baby forms hadn't appeared in earlier generations, tying mechanical requirements to breeding lore. This incense mechanic vanished with Generation 9, simplified away in favor of automatic baby form production. Now breeding always yields the youngest possible form without requiring held items. The change streamlined the breeding process while removing a layer of preparation that had defined baby Pokemon acquisition for nearly 2 decades. The shift reflected broader design philosophies moving toward accessibility and reduced friction in core gameplay systems. What once required planning and specific items now happens naturally, perhaps making the baby stage feel more fundamental rather than conditional. Generation 3 introduced the first wild baby Pokemon encounter through Winot on Mirage Island. The location itself was extraordinarily rare, appearing based on hidden values tied to Pokemon in the player's party. Finding the island meant finding Winot in the wild rather than breeding for it. This availability expanded in Generation 4 and beyond, with baby Pokemon becoming encounters in specific locations rather than breeding exclusive creatures. The shift made these earliest forms more accessible while maintaining their relative rarity through specific habitat requirements. Most baby Pokemon function as cross-generation pre-evolutions, added to families that originated in earlier releases. 3 exceptions exist in Togepi, Riolu, and Toxel, introduced alongside their evolved forms rather than added retroactively. These 3 debuted as baby Pokemon without the evolutionary family preceding them, designed from the start as creatures that begin small and grow. The distinction matters little in practical terms, but reveals different design approaches to evolutionary families and generational planning. Baby Pokemon connect directly to egg moves, special techniques that can only be inherited through breeding rather than learned through level progression or teaching machines. These moves often provide strategic options unavailable through normal gameplay, creating incentives for breeding even in generations where wild baby Pokemon appear naturally. The baby stage becomes the vehicle through which these inherited techniques enter a family line. A Pichu born with Volt Tackle can evolve into a Pikachu that retains that signature move, creating competitive options that wouldn't exist otherwise. The breeding system transforms baby Pokemon from mere curiosities into strategic necessities. Split evolutions introduce branching paths within single evolutionary lines, moments where a Pokemon faces multiple possible futures depending on the method used to trigger transformation. Gloom can become Vileplume through a Leaf Stone, or Blossom through a Sunstone. Scyther splits into Sizer when traded holding a metal coat, or Cleavor when exposed to black augurite. The branches create distinct outcomes from identical starting points, allowing trainers to shape their team composition through evolution choices rather than initial capture decisions. These branches often reflect wildly different typings despite sharing a common ancestor. Sizer gains steel typing while Cleavor gains rock. The split evolutions of Eevee demonstrate this principle across 8 different outcomes, each representing a unique elemental specialization. Every evolution maintains the same base stat total, but distributes those numbers differently across attributes. Vaporeon emphasizes hit points and special attack, becoming a bulky special attacker. Flareon prioritizes physical attack, creating a completely different battle role from identical genetic material. The stat redistribution ensures split evolutions aren't simply aesthetic variations, but fundamentally different creatures in mechanical terms. Some split evolutions show minimal stat differences, adjusting only 1 or 2 attributes while keeping the rest nearly identical. Vileplume and Bellossom exemplify this subtler approach, sharing most of their stat distribution while diverging in specific areas. Gardevoir and Galad demonstrate clearer distinctions, with Gardevoir leaning into special attack and Galad emphasizing physical combat. These differences inform team building and strategic planning, turning single Pokemon into multiple potential roles, depending on evolutionary path chosen. The system rewards understanding both options before committing to a transformation that cannot be reversed. Split evolutions grant players agency over team composition in ways that linear evolution paths cannot. A trainer catching Kirlia faces a choice between Gardevoir's psychic elegance and Galad's fighting prowess. The decision shapes battle strategy, type coverage, and aesthetic preferences simultaneously. This choice matters more in games without extensive trading or catching options, where each team member represents a significant investment of time and resources. Split evolutions ensure that investment can be directed toward specific needs rather than locked into predetermined outcomes. The branching creates replayability through different choices in subsequent playthroughs. Cross-generation evolutions extend families forward in time, adding new stages to lines previously considered complete. Scyther gained Sizer in Generation 2. Porygon received Porygon 2 in the same generation, then Porygon Zid in Generation 4. These additions retroactively enhanced older Pokemon by giving them new potential, making early catches remain relevant throughout longer gameplay experiences. The evolution extends progression beyond the original design's endpoint, creating depth where none existed before. A Pokemon considered fully evolved suddenly becomes a middle stage, reframing its identity within an expanded family. These cross-generation additions sometimes arrive decades after the original Pokemon's introduction. Ursaring gained Ursaluna in Generation 8's Legends Arceus, 23 years after Ursaring first appeared. Stantler evolved into Wyrdeer in the same game after 21 years of being single stage. The delayed additions suggest that design teams continually revisit older Pokemon, considering how to expand their families or improve their competitive viability. Each new generation becomes an opportunity to enhance beloved creatures from the past, maintaining their relevance amid hundreds of newer designs competing for attentions in team slots. Regional forms emerged in Generation 7 as alternate versions of existing Pokemon adapted to different environments and ecosystems. Alolan forms introduced tropical and volcanic variations of Kanto Pokemon, reimagining them with new typings and abilities suited to island life. Vulpix became an ice type in Alola, adapting to snowy mountain peaks rather than grassland habitats. Executor grew tall as a grass dragon type, supposedly representing its true form, unhindered by Kanto's climate. These variations suggest that Pokemon adapt to regional conditions over generations, developing distinct characteristics based on environmental pressures. Galarian forms continued the concept in Generation 8, showing industrial and weathered variations appropriate to the Galar region's aesthetic. Meowth became Steel type, developing metallic properties from living among miners and smiths. Umpanita gained fairy typing and psychedelic coloring, inhabiting enchanted forests rather than open plains. Each regional form tells a story about adaptation and environmental influence, suggesting that Pokemon species maintain enough genetic flexibility to develop distinct regional variants over time. The forms provide both mechanical variety and narrative depth, explaining why the same species might appear dramatically different across different regions. Hisuian forms in Legends Arceus presented historical variations, showing how certain Pokemon appeared in ancient Sinnoh before modern development altered their habitats and behaviors. These forms sometimes represent evolutionary dead ends, creatures that adapted one way in the past but evolved differently in the present. Hisuian Typhlosion became a ghost type, suggesting that ancient cultures and spiritual connections influenced Pokemon development in ways that modern regions cannot replicate. The historical forms create a sense of lost diversity, species that once existed but vanished as regions developed and changed. And if you're still drifting through these details, maybe take a moment to subscribe before sleep takes you completely. Paldean forms arrived with Generation 9, though in smaller numbers than previous regional variant introductions. Tauros received 3 distinct Paldean forms, each representing a different breeding population with unique typing combinations. The variations suggest that even within a single region, isolated populations can develop distinct characteristics over time. Regional forms have become an expected feature of new generations, a way to revisit classic Pokemon while introducing mechanical variety without designing entirely new creatures. The concept allows beloved species to remain relevant across multiple generations through environmental reinterpretation. Convergent species represent a different approach to variation, creatures that superficially resemble existing Pokemon through convergent evolution rather than genetic relationship. Wiglet resembles Diglett, but belongs to an entirely different evolutionary lineage, adapted to similar environmental niches. Toadscool looks nearly identical to Tentacool, yet evolved independently in separate ecosystems. These convergent species lack the explicit regional connection that regional forms possess, instead, demonstrating how similar environmental pressures can produce similar outcomes in unrelated species. The concept introduces subtle humor through obvious visual parallels while maintaining taxonomic separation. The distinction between regional forms and convergent species matters in breeding and evolution mechanics. Regional forms breed true within their region, but can produce original forms when bred with original form parents. Convergent species cannot breed with their visual counterparts at all, belonging to different evolutionary families despite superficial similarities. This separation maintains the integrity of convergent evolution as a concept distinct from regional adaptation, ensuring the two categories serve different purposes within the broader Pokemon taxonomy. The mechanical differences reinforce the narrative differences between adaptation and coincidence. Gigantamax Pokemon represent temporary transformations available to specific individuals within certain species. Unlike normal Dynamax, which any Pokemon can perform in appropriate areas, Gigantamax requires a particular Pokemon to possess the Gigantamax factor, a rare trait that changes both size and form during Dynamaxing. Gigantamax Charizard gains a massively enhanced appearance with wing patterns resembling flames. Gigantamax Pikachu becomes substantially rounder, resembling its original design from early Pokemon generations. These transformations last only 3 turns before reverting, but they change the Pokemon's appearance and max move options during that brief window. Only certain species can Gigantamax, and even within those species, only individuals with the Gigantamax factor can access the transformation. This rarity made Gigantamax Pokemon prized in Generation 8, obtained through max raid battles or special distributions rather than normal wild encounters. The Isle of Armor expansion introduced Max Soup, an item that could grant any Pokemon of the appropriate species the ability to Gigantamax. This addition democratized access somewhat while maintaining the feature's special status. The temporary nature of Gigantamax differentiated it from Mega Evolution's similar concept in previous generations, emphasizing spectacle over sustained transformation. Gigantamax moves replace the standard max moves that normal Dynamax provides, offering unique effects and enhanced power. Gigantamax Charizard's G-Max Wildfire deals damage while setting the opponent's field with residual fire damage for multiple turns. Gigantamax Pikachu's G-Max Volt Crash paralyzes all opponents while dealing damage. These enhanced moves created strategic incentives for using Gigantamax over normal Dynamax when possible, making the rarity of Gigantamax factor Pokemon a competitive advantage. The moves tied into the visual spectacle of the transformation, making Gigantamax feel impactful beyond simple size increase. Legendary Pokemon occupy the highest tier of rarity and power within the standard Pokemon hierarchy. These creatures appear prominently in regional lore and mythology, often serving as box art mascots for main series games. They divide into 2 informal categories based on base stat totals and narrative prominence. Main legendary Pokemon typically possess base stat totals between 670 and 680, representing the most powerful standard legendary creatures. These include the box legends like Lugia, Gruden, Dialga, and Reshiram. Their power level restricts their usage in certain competitive formats, and their rarity makes them prized possessions for trainers who manage to capture them. Sub-legendary Pokemon occupy a lower power tier with base stat totals typically between 570 and 600. These creatures still count as legendary and maintain similar rarity in most cases, but their reduced power makes them more viable in competitive formats that restrict higher tier legendaries. The legendary birds from Kanto, the legendary beasts from Johto, and the Regitrio from Hoenn all fall into this sub-legendary category. They appear in trios or duos more often than main legendaries, suggesting greater population numbers within the Pokemon world despite their rarity from a gameplay perspective. Most legendary Pokemon cannot evolve, existing as single-stage creatures at the peak of their potential. Cosmog and Cosmoem break this pattern, evolving into Solgaleo or Lunala, depending on game version in Generation 7. This evolutionary path creates narrative opportunities through Cosmog's helpless early form, maturing into one of the game's box legendaries. The evolution suggests that even legendary creatures undergo development and growth, though this remains an exceptional case rather than a common pattern among legendary Pokemon. The uniqueness of evolving legendaries makes them memorable exceptions that prove the general rule. Legendary Pokemon often tie directly into regional creation myths and catastrophe narratives. Dialga and Palkia control time and space respectively, forming fundamental aspects of the Pokemon universe's structure. Gruden and Kyogre shaped continents and oceans, their ancient battles determining the geography of the Hoenn region. Those mythological connections elevate legendaries beyond simple powerful creatures into fundamental forces within their worlds. Their appearance and gameplay often coincides with regional crises that require their power to resolve, positioning them as both threats and saviors depending on circumstance and control. And mythical Pokemon represent an even rarer category than legendaries, traditionally obtainable only through special events and distributions rather than normal gameplay. These creatures appear in lore and legend, but remain unavailable through standard exploration or progression. Mew, the genetic ancestor of all Pokemon, became mythical through its hidden status in Generation 1, obtainable only through official distributions or glitches rather than normal play. Celebi, Jirachi, and Deoxys continued this pattern in subsequent generations, each requiring event participation to obtain legally. The mythical designation originally meant limited time availability, with distributions occurring during specific windows tied to movie releases or other promotional events. Missing the distribution window meant missing the Pokemon entirely within that game, creating a sense of urgency and exclusivity. This model generated frustration among completionists who couldn't attend events or access distributions in their regions. Generation 9 changed this paradigm by making mythical Pokemon obtainable during normal gameplay for the first time, incorporating them into the Indigo Disc DLC as rewards for specific activities. This shift addressed long-standing accessibility complaints while maintaining mythical status through special acquisition methods. Mythical Pokemon typically possess base stat totals around 600, placing them between sub-legendaries and main legendaries in power level. Their exclusion from most competitive formats stems from their event distribution history rather than overwhelming power, maintaining separation between standard gameplay balance and special promotional creatures. Some competitive formats have allowed specific mythical Pokemon, testing whether their power levels disrupt competitive balance or fit within acceptable parameters. These experiments remain exceptions rather than standard practice, keeping mythicals largely separate from competitive play, despite their moderate stats compared to main legendaries. The mythology surrounding mythical Pokemon often emphasizes their elusiveness and mysterious nature more than their power. Mew's genetic perfection and rarity makes it legendary within Pokemon world lore, regardless of its modest stats. Celebi's time-traveling abilities create narrative opportunities without requiring it to be the most powerful creature in existence. Mythical Pokemon derive their special status from story and mystery rather than pure combat capability, differentiating them from legendaries, who often function as regional guardians or primordial forces. The narrative weight matters more than the numbers in defining what makes a Pokemon mythical versus legendary. Ultra Beasts form a distinct category separate from legendaries, despite similar rarity and power levels. These extra-dimensional creatures originate from Ultra Space, a parallel dimension accessed through Ultra Wormholes. Generation 7 introduced Ultra Beasts as central antagonists in the Alola region's story, portraying them as invasive species that disrupt local ecosystems when they cross dimensional boundaries. Their alien designs emphasize their otherness, featuring asymmetric proportions and unusual type combinations that set them apart from standard Pokemon aesthetics. Each Ultra Beast possesses a code name in addition to its species name, reinforcing their classification as threats rather than natural creatures. Ultra Beasts typically possess base stat totals around 570, placing them in sub-legendary territory for power level. Nihilego, Buzzwole, Pheromosa, and others maintain this consistent power range with some variation. Ultra Necrozma breaks this pattern significantly, achieving a base stat total that rivals or exceeds main legendaries. This exception reflects Necrozma's unique status as both Ultra Beast and legendary Pokemon depending on form. The trading card game classifies Necrozma's fused forms with Solgaleo and Lunala as Ultra Beasts, though the base Necrozma lacks this designation. The classification ambiguity highlights the complexity of categorizing creatures that exist between traditional taxonomic boundaries. Lunala, Solgaleo, and Necrozma possess inherent connections to Ultra Space, despite not being classified as Ultra Beasts themselves. These legendary Pokemon can open and travel through Ultra Wormholes, suggesting evolutionary or dimensional ties to the Ultra Beast home dimension. This connection implies that the boundary between Pokemon and Ultra Beasts might be less absolute than initially suggested, with some creatures straddling both categories or transitioning between them. The relationship between Alola's legendaries and Ultra Beasts creates narrative depth while complicating taxonomic certainty. Ultra Beasts challenged players' conceptions of what Pokemon could be, introducing creatures that looked and felt genuinely alien compared to the established aesthetic. Kartana's origami-inspired form, Celesteela's bamboo rocket design, and Guzzlord's horrifying mouth-dominated body pushed visual boundaries in ways that standard Pokemon rarely attempt. This alienness served the narrative purpose of making Ultra Beasts feel like genuine threats and ecological disruptors rather than simply rare, powerful creatures. Their eventual integration into teams and competitive play normalized them somewhat, but their designs maintain their otherworldly quality even after familiarity reduces their initial shock value. Paradox Pokémon emerged in Generation 9 as temporal anomalies rather than dimensional ones, creatures pulled from past or future through the time machine hidden beneath Area 0 in the Paldea region. These Pokemon split into two distinct groups based on temporal origin. Ancient Paradox. Pokemon resemble prehistoric versions of modern species, featuring more primal and aggressive designs that suggest how certain Pokemon might have appeared in primordial times. Great Tusk resembles ancient Donphan, Screamtail evokes prehistoric Jigglypuff, and Brute Bonnet suggests primordial Amoonguss, adapted to harsher ancient ecosystems. Future Paradox Pokémon present the opposite temporal extreme, showing mechanical and futuristic interpretations of modern species as they might appear millennia hence. Iron Bundle resembles a robotic Delibird. Iron Valiant combines aspects of Gardevoir and Galade into a sleek, mechanical form, and Iron Treads presents Donphan reimagined as a motorized wheel creature. These future forms suggest a timeline where Pokemon have been extensively modified or replaced by mechanical approximations, though the game deliberately maintains ambiguity about whether these represent actual future evolution or simply one possible timeline among many. All Paradox Pokemon share the genderless trait and belong to the undiscovered egg group, preventing them from breeding entirely. This reproductive isolation makes sense narratively for creatures pulled from different time periods, but it also limits their availability to direct catches rather than breeding programs. The restriction maintains their rarity and special status while preventing exploitation of their typically strong stats for competitive breeding purposes. Players cannot pass down egg moves or breed for specific natures and abilities, as they might with standard Pokemon, forcing direct engagement with the wild Paradox populations in Area 0. Base stat totals for Paradox Pokemon consistently hit 570, placing them in sub-legendary territory for power level. This consistency across all Paradox species creates balance within the category while making them competitively relevant without overwhelming standard Pokemon. Every Paradox Pokemon possesses either Photosynthesis or Quark Drive as their ability, matching their temporal origin. Ancient Paradox Pokemon carry Photosynthesis, which boosts their highest stat in harsh sunlight. Future Paradox Pokémon have Quark Drive, which boosts their highest stat in electric terrain. These signature abilities reinforce the temporal split between ancient sun-powered creatures and future electric-powered machines. Koraidon and Miraidon exist as legendary exceptions within the Paradox category, serving as the box legendaries for Scarlet and Violet, respectively, while maintaining Paradox characteristics. Their base stat total significantly exceeds standard Paradox Pokémon, reaching legendary power levels while retaining the temporal displacement narrative. Koraidon represents the ancient extreme with its reptilian and primal design, while Miraidon embodies the future extreme through its jet-like mechanical appearance. These legendary Paradox Pokémon serve as the player's primary transportation and companion throughout the game, integrating the Paradox concept directly into gameplay progression rather than leaving it as post-game content. The time machine responsible for Paradox Pokemon's appearance raises questions about temporal causality and the nature of time in the Pokemon universe. Whether these creatures represent actual past and future or simply alternate timelines remains deliberately ambiguous in the game's narrative. The ambiguity allows players to interpret Paradox Pokemon as cautionary tales about tampering with time, scientific curiosities from alternate realities, or genuine glimpses of temporal extremes. This narrative flexibility makes Paradox Pokemon more conceptually interesting than simple power-scaled variants, while justifying their existence within Generation 9's specific story context. Fossil Pokemon represent a long-standing category dating back to Generation 1, creatures restored from ancient remains found in stone. These Pokemon always possess rock typing as their primary or secondary type, reflecting their fossilized origin and stone-based resurrection process. The resurrection itself occurs through specialized machines that reconstruct living Pokemon from preserved genetic material in the fossils. This process explains why fossil Pokemon weren't simply discovered living in remote areas, having genuinely gone extinct before being artificially restored through human technology. Each generation has introduced new fossil Pokemon with varying degrees of historical accuracy in their designs. Kabuto and Omanate from Generation 1 drew inspiration from actual prehistoric creatures, trilobites and ammonites, respectively. Later generations continued this pattern with Cranidos resembling Pachycephalosaurus, Tyrant clearly based on Tyrannosaurus rex, and Arctovish combining ancient fish characteristics. The designs balance paleontological inspiration with the fantastical elements expected in Pokemon, creating creatures that feel ancient while maintaining the series' aesthetic consistency. Generation 8 introduced a controversial twist to fossil Pokemon through the combination system in Galar. Players mix and match two different fossil pieces to create hybrid creatures, resulting in Pokemon that appear to be incorrect assemblies of parts that don't naturally belong together. Dracovish combines a fish head with a dinosaur body. Arctozolt pairs a dinosaur head with electric generator lower half. These combinations create unsettling designs that many players interpret as commentary on early paleontology's tendency to incorrectly reconstruct fossils from mixed specimens. The disturbing implications of creating potentially malformed creatures add unexpected darkness to what had been a straightforward resurrection mechanic. The Galar fossil combinations cannot be separated once created, permanently binding these mismatched parts into living creatures. This irreversibility suggests either that the resurrection process fundamentally alters the genetic material, or that the creatures somehow function despite their apparent wrongness. Pokédex entries for these Galar fossils often reference breathing difficulties, movement problems, or other complications stemming from their hybrid nature. These details imply that the player actively creates suffering through the fossil combination process, an unusually grim element for a series that generally avoids such implications. The controversy surrounding these designs sparked significant community discussion about whether they represent creative innovation or misstep in Pokemon design philosophy. Fossil Pokemon remain genderless in most cases, unable to breed and limited to direct resurrection from fossils. This restriction maintains their rarity throughout gameplay and prevents infinite fossil Pokemon generation once the resurrection process becomes available. Players must choose which fossils to resurrect when limited fossil items exist, creating meaningful decisions about team composition and collection completion. The breeding restriction also makes sense narratively for creatures that went extinct and exist only through artificial restoration rather than natural reproduction. Starter Pokemon form one of the most recognized categories within the franchise, the three creatures offered at the beginning of most main series games. These Pokemon follow consistent patterns across generations while allowing individual variation within that framework. Fire, water, and grass types dominate starter choices, forming the classic type triangle where each starter has an advantage over one other and a disadvantage against the third. This balanced rock, paper, scissors relationship encourages strategic thinking from the earliest moments of gameplay while ensuring no starter choice provides an overwhelming advantage over others. Starter Pokemon always feature three-stage evolutionary lines, beginning as small, relatively weak creatures and culminating in powerful final forms. This progression mirrors the player's journey through the game, with starter evolution serving as a tangible marker of progress and growth. The final evolutions typically reach base stat totals around 525 to 535, placing them in solidly viable territory for competitive play without overwhelming non-starter options. This power level makes starters worthwhile investments throughout the game while preventing them from trivializing challenges or making other team members redundant. Each generation's starters receive significant promotional attention and merchandise production, appearing in anime, movies, and promotional materials more frequently than most other Pokemon. This prominence stems from their role as the player's first major decision and often their most consistently used team member throughout the game. Charizard's massive popularity transformed it into a franchise icon despite being one of many fire starters. Greninja achieved similar iconic status through combination of design appeal and prominent anime appearances. Starter Pokemon benefit from this promotional push while also earning it through their central role in player experience. Gender ratios for starter Pokemon heavily favor males at 7 males to 1 female across all species. This ratio makes female starters rare and valued by players who prioritize collecting or breeding. The consistent ratio across all starters suggests a deliberate design choice rather than species-specific justification, though the reasoning behind this choice remains unclear. The rarity of female starters creates frustration for players attempting to breed their starter Pokemon, requiring either extensive soft resetting at the game start or acceptance of male starters that cannot pass down their species through breeding without Ditto. Some starter Pokemon gain additional forms or mechanics that extend beyond typical starter conventions. Greninja received Battle Bond as a special ability in Generation 7, allowing it to transform into Ash Greninja during battle after knocking out opponents. Incineroar became a popular choice in competitive doubles formats due to its Intimidate ability and support move options. Decidueye received a Hisuian form in Legends Arceus that changed its typing to grass fighting, creating an alternate take on the Generation 7 starter. These exceptions demonstrate that while starter Pokemon follow general patterns, individual species can receive special attention that elevates them beyond their category's baseline expectations. Pseudo-Legendary Pokemon represent the highest tier of standard Pokemon power, creatures with base stat totals at exactly 603 stage evolutionary lines. The term pseudo-legendary originated in the fan community rather than official sources, but it effectively describes Pokemon that approach legendary power levels while remaining breedable and more available than actual legendaries. Dragonite established the template in Generation 1 with its 600 base stat total and dragon typing. Subsequent generations continued the pattern with Tyranitar, Salamence, Metagross, Garchomp, Hydreigon, Goodra, Kamo-O, and Dragapult, each filling the pseudo-legendary role for their respective generations. These Pokemon typically require significant investment to obtain and train, with final evolutions not occurring until level 60 or later in many cases. This late evolution timing prevents players from accessing pseudo-legendary power during the main story in most cases, reserving their full potential for post-game content or dedicated training. The investment required creates a sense of accomplishment when finally achieving the final evolution, making pseudo-legendary Pokemon feel earned rather than simply found or given. This progression from weak early form to dominant late form follows starter Pokemon patterns, but extends across a longer level curve with a higher power ceiling. Dragon typing appears frequently among pseudo-legendary Pokemon, with Dragonite, Salamence, Garchomp, and Goodra all featuring the type. This prevalence reflects Dragon's traditional association with power and rarity in the series, though later generations have diversified pseudo-legendary typing. Metagross brought Steel Psychic typing to the category. Tyranitar established Rock Dark as a viable pseudo-legendary combination. Dragapult introduced Dragon Ghost, showing that the category remains open to type experimentation despite Dragon's historical dominance. The power level matters more than the specific typing in defining pseudo-legendary status. Competitive battling sees heavy pseudo-legendary usage due to their stat totals approaching legendary territory, while remaining legal in formats that ban actual legendaries. Garchomp became a staple of Generation 4 and 5 competitive teams through its combinations of high speed and attack stats. Salamence's Mega Evolution in Generation 6 created one of the most dominant sweepers in the competitive metagame. These Pokemon bridge the gap between standard viable choices and legendary restricted formats, providing high power options that don't trigger legendary bans. Their prevalence in competitive play validates the pseudo-legendary designation and confirms their position at the top of standard Pokemon power hierarchies. The pseudo-legendary category lacks official recognition despite its clear pattern and community acceptance. Game Freak has never formally designated these Pokemon as pseudo-legendaries, leaving the term as community consensus rather than official taxonomy. This unofficial status doesn't diminish the category's utility in understanding Pokemon power distribution and progression systems. Players recognize pseudo-legendary patterns immediately when examining new generation reveals, anticipating which three-stage line will occupy the 600 base stat total slot. The unofficial nature actually demonstrates the community's engagement with game systems and willingness to create organizing frameworks that enhance understanding and discussion. Mega Evolution represented a temporary transformation system introduced in Generation 6, allowing specific Pokemon to achieve more powerful forms during battle through Megastones and Keystones. The transformation lasted only for the duration of the battle, reverting automatically when the battle ended. This temporary nature differentiated Mega Evolution from Standard Evolution, creating a strategic resource that players activated at key moments rather than a permanent power increase. The system allowed older Pokemon to receive power boosts that brought them into competitive viability without replacing their classic designs entirely. Mega Evolutions increased base stat totals by exactly 100 points distributed across the Pokemon's stats in ways that enhanced their particular strengths or addressed specific weaknesses. Mega Charizard gained significant special attack increases, while Mega Kangaskhan's parental bond ability doubled its physical attack effectiveness. These transformations created distinct competitive niches for Pokemon that might otherwise have been overshadowed by newer, more powerful species. The system revitalized older generations' Pokemon while introducing new strategic considerations about when to Mega Evolve and which Pokemon to build teams around. The Mega Evolution system required both the Pokemon and trainer to possess specific items. The Pokemon held a species-specific Megastone, while the trainer possessed a Keystone, typically embedded in a Mega Ring or other accessory. During battle, the trainer could activate the Keystone once per battle to trigger the Mega Evolution of the Pokemon holding the corresponding Megastone. This once per battle restriction created meaningful decisions about timing and which Pokemon to Mega Evolve when multiple team members possessed Mega Evolution potential. The restriction prevented teams from fielding multiple Mega Evolutions simultaneously, maintaining balance while allowing the mechanic's power spikes. Generation 6 introduced 48 Mega Evolutions, including 2 separate Mega Forms for Charizard and Mewtwo, covering both new and classic Pokemon. Generation 7 added no new Mega Evolutions, and Generation 8 removed the mechanic entirely from Sword and Shield before reintroducing it in the remakes Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. This inconsistent implementation suggested uncertainty about Mega Evolution's place in the series moving forward. The mechanic's absence from Generation 8's primary games disappointed players who had built teams and strategies around specific Mega Evolutions. The return in remakes but absence from new titles established Mega Evolution as a legacy feature rather than an ongoing gameplay element. The removal of Mega Evolution from primary new releases, starting with Generation 8, reflected a broader pattern of introducing and then abandoning transformation mechanics. Z moves replaced Mega Evolution in Generation 7 before being replaced by Dynamax in Generation 8. This cycle of replacement creates discontinuity across generations and frustrates players who invest in specific mechanics only to see them removed in subsequent games. However, it also allows each generation to establish distinct mechanical identities, rather than accumulating increasingly complex transformation systems that new players must learn simultaneously. The trade-offs between mechanical continuity and generational distinctiveness remain unresolved in the series' design philosophy. Shiny Pokemon represent alternate color palettes that appear extremely rarely in wild encounters, with odds historically set at approximately 1 in 4,096 encounters in recent generations. These alternate colorations serve no mechanical purpose, providing only cosmetic differences from standard specimens. The rarity makes shiny Pokemon highly prized among collectors and dedicated players willing to invest significant time in hunting for specific shiny targets. The sparkle effect that appears when a shiny Pokemon enters battle provides immediate visual confirmation of the rare encounter, creating moments of genuine excitement and surprise during otherwise routine gameplay. Early generations featured less sophisticated shiny Pokemon designs, with some species receiving only slight hue shifts that made them difficult to distinguish from standard colors. Generation 2 introduced the shiny mechanic alongside the color capabilities of Game Boy Color, with Gyarados appearing as a forced, shiny encounter in the Lake of Rage story event. Later generations refined shiny color schemes while maintaining the extreme rarity that makes shiny hunting a dedicated endgame activity. Some shiny forms, like Charizard's black coloration or Umbreon's blue rings, became iconic alternate designs, while others, like Gengar's barely perceptible shade difference, remain controversial among the shiny hunting community. Various methods increase shiny encounter rates beyond the base odds through dedicated mechanics and player effort. The Masuda method increases shiny odds in breeding when using parents from games with different language settings. Consecutive fishing in Generation 6 increased shiny odds with each successful chain. Pokemon Let's Go introduced catch combo mechanics, where catching the same species repeatedly increased shiny odds. Sword and Shield featured both random overworld shiny spawns and increased odds through battle count tracking. These methods reward dedicated effort with improved odds while maintaining shiny Pokemon's special status through still significant rarity. The shiny charm item increases shiny encounter odds across all encounter methods once obtained, typically requiring Pokedex completion or near completion. This reward for completionist play provides tangible benefits for players who invest in filling their Pokedex beyond the achievement itself. Combined with other shiny boosting methods, the shiny charm can reduce full odds shiny hunting to approximately 1 in 512 encounters in optimal conditions. These improved odds make targeted shiny hunting viable as a long-term goal rather than pure chance, creating an endgame activity that extends gameplay hours significantly for interested players. Shiny hunting communities have developed around documenting and sharing rare shiny encounters, creating social networks focused on this specific gameplay element. Live streams of shiny hunts attract viewers who experience the excitement vicariously while providing company and encouragement during the often lengthy hunting process. The community has established value hierarchies among different shiny Pokemon based on rarity of encounter, visual appeal of the shiny palette, and personal preference. Shiny legendary Pokemon command particular prestige due to combining the rarity of legendary encounters with shiny odds, creating double rare specimens that represent hundreds or thousands of hours of soft resetting. Alpha Pokemon appeared in Legends Arceus as larger, more aggressive variants of standard species with guaranteed perfect individual values in several stats and increased aggression toward the player. These Pokemon appear as fixed spawns in specific locations, providing consistent opportunities to hunt for particular alpha specimens. The size difference makes alpha Pokemon immediately identifiable in the overworld, with glowing red eyes adding to their threatening appearance. Their enhanced stats and guaranteed perfect eye vuses make them valuable for players building competitive teams, while their imposing presence creates memorable encounters during exploration. Fixed alpha spawns provide reliable locations to obtain specific species with enhanced stats, removing some of the randomness that characterizes most Pokemon catching. Players can repeatedly attempt to catch specific alpha Pokemon until successful rather than hoping for rare wild spawns. This reliability combined with enhanced stats positions alpha Pokemon as stepping stones toward competitive ready teams without requiring extensive breeding programs. The system rewards exploration and combat skill rather than pure chance, aligning with Legends Arceus's more action-oriented gameplay compared to traditional main series entries. The size difference of alpha Pokemon affects gameplay in subtle ways beyond visual impact. Larger models interact with the environment differently, potentially affecting stealth approaches and battle positioning. Their increased aggression means they pursue the player more persistently when aggravated, creating risk during exploration of areas with multiple alpha spawns. This behavioral difference makes alpha Pokemon feel genuinely different from standard specimens beyond their stat advantages, contributing to Legends Arceus's more dynamic wild encounter system compared to traditional random grass encounters. Alpha spawns respawn after leaving and returning to the area, allowing multiple attempts to catch desired specimens or farm multiple alpha versions of the same species. This respawn mechanic encourages mastery of catching techniques and battle strategies specific to each alpha spawn location. Players develop optimized approaches to specific alpha encounters, learning patterns and developing strategies that increase catch success rates. The reliability of alpha spawns creates a structured in-game activity similar to legendary hunting, but with more immediate respawn cycles and less time investment per attempt. Noble Pokemon in Legends, Arceus represent boss battles against frenzied Pokemon blessed by Arceus and driven temporarily violent by external forces. These encounters blend traditional turn-based combat with action-based dodging and projectile throwing mechanics, requiring players to calm the noble Pokemon by hitting them with bombs between battle phases. The hybrid combat system creates distinct gameplay experiences compared to standard wild encounters or trainer battles. Noble Pokemon cannot be caught during these story encounters, serving purely as obstacles and narrative devices rather than collectible specimens. Each noble Pokemon ties directly into the story progression, with defeating them required to advance through the game's main narrative. Their frenzied states result from external manipulation rather than natural aggression, positioning them as victims requiring help rather than simply powerful enemies to defeat. This framing maintains the series' general reluctance to portray Pokemon as inherently evil or irredeemable. The noble Pokemon regain their senses after defeat, returning to their roles as region protectors and blessing the player with their strength. This resolution reinforces themes of coexistence and mutual benefit between humans and Pokemon. The noble Pokemon include Kleavor, Lilligant, Arcanine, Electrode, and Avalugg as the 5 main story nobles, each tied to a specific area and clan. Their selection spans multiple types and playstyles, ensuring variety in the boss encounters throughout the story progression. Some noble Pokemon feature Hydreian forms created specifically for Legends Arceus, while others use standard or new evolutionary forms introduced in the game. This mix of familiar and novel designs helps noble Pokemon feel special while maintaining connections to established Pokemon species. The frenzied state mechanics establish that Pokemon can be corrupted or driven violent by external forces, expanding the series' willingness to portray temporary antagonism in normally peaceful creatures. This darker edge aligns with Legends Arceus's more mature tone and historical setting compared to mainline games. The frenzied noble Pokemon attack the player directly rather than fighting through proxy battles, increasing personal stakes and creating tension. The calming process through bomb throwing provides non-violent problem solving even while engaging in combat, maintaining the series' general themes while introducing mechanical variety. Totem Pokemon appeared in Generation 7 as special boss encounters in trial challenges, Alola region's alternative to traditional gym battles. These Pokemon appeared larger than normal specimens and automatically summoned ally Pokemon upon entering battle, creating 2-on-1 encounters that challenged single trainers. The aura surrounding Totem Pokemon provided stat boosts that made them more dangerous than wild Pokemon of equivalent level. These mechanics combined to create challenging encounters that required strategic preparation and adaptable tactics beyond simply having high-level Pokemon. Trial captains assigned players challenges culminating in Totem Pokemon battles, with each trial focusing on specific types or environmental themes. The Totem Pokemon selected for each trial reflected those themes, with Totem Raticate appearing in the normal type trial and Totem Lurantis heading the grass trial. This type specialization allowed players to prepare specifically for upcoming Totem battles while maintaining challenge through stat boosts and ally Pokemon. The system provided structures similar to gym progression while implementing distinct mechanics that differentiated Alola from previous regions. Defeated Totem Pokemon sometimes became available for the player to obtain through special distributions or post-game mechanics, allowing players to add these enhanced specimens to their collections. The gifted Totem Pokemon maintained their larger size from the trial encounters, creating permanent visual distinction from standard captures. This reward system encouraged completion of all trials beyond the immediate story benefit, providing collectible unique Pokemon forms. The size difference served no mechanical purpose, but created prestige around owning totem-sized specimens. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon featured different totem Pokemon for several trials compared to the original Sun and Moon, creating variation and challenges for players experiencing both versions. This difference encouraged purchasing both versions, or at least acknowledging mechanical variation between them beyond simply different legendary captures. The changed totem Pokemon required different strategies and preparations, preventing players from simply reusing successful team compositions across both games. The variation demonstrated that trial challenges could be modified and rebalanced without fundamentally changing the trial structure or progression. The totem Pokemon system vanished after Generation 7, replaced by traditional gym battles in Generation 8 and alternative progression structures in Generation 9. This discontinuation left totem Pokemon as a generation-specific mechanic rather than an ongoing feature, similar to Mega Evolution's irregular implementation. The removal suggested that while totem Pokemon created memorable encounters, they required dedicated design work for each trial that exceeded the benefit compared to traditional gym battles. The generation-specific nature makes totem Pokemon memorable as an experimental progression system rather than a permanent fixture of the series. Form differences within single species create variation without requiring completely separate Pokemon designs. These forms typically share the same Pokédex number and species name, while possessing distinct appearances and sometimes different types or abilities. Burmy and Wormadam demonstrate form variation based on evolutionary conditions, with 3 distinct cloak types depending on where Burmy last battled before evolution. The form determines Wormadam's secondary typing, creating 3 separate competitive options from a single evolutionary source. This design encourages experimentation with evolution conditions rather than simply leveling up repeatedly. Unowned features: 28 distinct forms representing letters of the alphabet, plus question mark and exclamation point forms, creating massive variation within a single species. Each form remains purely cosmetic with identical stats and move pool across all variations. This implementation prioritizes collection and aesthetic variation over mechanical differentiation. Players collecting all unowned forms engage in a dedicated hunting activity, similar to shiny collecting but with much higher success rates. The forms create depth within what would otherwise be a relatively simple, single-stage Pokemon without evolutionary progression. Rotom possesses 6 forms beyond its base form, each accessed by interacting with specific appliances. These forms change Rotom's secondary typing and signature move, creating distinct competitive options from a single base Pokemon. Rotom Wash gained particular prominence in competitive battling through its excellent typing and utility move pool. Rotom Mao provides grass coverage with different strengths and weaknesses. The appliance switching mechanic creates flexibility, allowing players to change Rotom forms between battles to address specific team needs or counter specific threats. This adaptability makes Rotom unique among form-changing Pokemon. Seasonal forms appear in Deerling and Sawsbuck, changing appearance based on the month or season when encountered. These forms remain purely aesthetic, with no stat or type variations across seasons. The changing forms create visual variety that reflects real-world seasonal transitions while maintaining consistent mechanical identity. Players can collect all 4 seasonal forms through patient waiting or trading with others in different time zones or save file timings. The seasonal forms demonstrate that purely cosmetic variation can create collection value and visual interest without requiring mechanical differentiation. Gender differences exist across many species, ranging from subtle coloration shifts to dramatic size and feature variations. Unfaisant males possess elaborate red and gold plumage, while females feature brown and green coloring, creating dramatic visual distinction between genders of the same species. Pikachu exhibits only a subtle tail shape difference, with females having heart shaped tail tips. These variations add naturalistic detail while providing collectors with additional goals in obtaining both male and female specimens of species with notable differences. The variation rewards close observation while rarely affecting mechanical gameplay. Shadow Pokemon appeared in Pokemon Colosseum and Pokemon XD, Gale of Darkness, as corrupted Pokemon with closed hearts, incapable of normal affection or growth. These Pokemon required purification through special processes that gradually reopened their hearts and restored them to normal Pokemon status. The Shadow state prevented experience gain and limited movesets to Shadow-type moves, making them temporarily inferior to standard Pokemon, despite often coming at evolved forms and higher levels. The purification process created narrative and mechanical progression distinct from simple training. Shadow moves dealt typeless damage super effective against standard Pokemon, but ineffective against other Shadow Pokemon, creating a combat system where Shadow Pokemon functioned as both powerful weapons and urgent problems to solve. The player's team initially consisted entirely of standard Pokemon, making encounters with Shadow Pokemon dangerous until the catching and purification process began building a roster of purified former Shadow Pokemon. This reversal of the usual Pokemon catching formula created unique gameplay where catching served immediate strategic benefit beyond simple collection. The purification chambers in XD accelerated the purification process through strategic placement of Pokemon with attributes that counteracted the Shadow Pokemon's corrupted state. This system required planning and roster management beyond simple time investment, rewarding players who engaged with the mechanic deeply rather than simply walking with Shadow Pokemon in the party. The purification system created structure around what could have been purely narrative corruption, making Shadow Pokemon mechanically distinct rather than simply aesthetically different standard Pokemon. Shadow Pokemon mechanics never appeared in main series games, despite Colosseum and XD's status as official Pokemon titles. This limitation to specific spin off games made Shadow Pokemon a generation specific mechanic tied to particular titles rather than an ongoing feature of the franchise. The absence from main series games suggests the mechanic's specific design requirements and darker themes didn't align with main series design goals. Shadow Pokemon remain memorable as a bold experiment in introducing genuinely corrupted Pokemon requiring rescue and rehabilitation. Purified Pokemon gained slight stat boosts and access to special moves unavailable to standard specimens, creating mechanical incentives for the purification process beyond narrative satisfaction. These bonuses made purified Pokemon somewhat superior to standard versions, rewarding the extra effort required for purification. The mechanical benefit ensured that players engaged with the purification system rather than leaving Shadow Pokemon in their corrupted state. This reward structure balanced the temporary disadvantages of Shadow status with long-term benefits that made the process feel worthwhile beyond simple story progression requirements. Pokemon size categories exist within species, with individual specimens varying in height and weight around species averages. These variations appear in Pokédex entries and can affect gameplay in specific instances. Legends Arceus introduced more prominent size variation with clearly observable differences in overworld model sizes. Some game mechanics key off size categories, such as Grass Knot and low kick dealing damage, based on target weight. These mechanics create niche strategic considerations where size matters beyond aesthetic variation. Extremely small or large specimens sometimes receive special recognition through size-checking NPCs who comment on exceptional specimens. These acknowledgments provide collection goals beyond simply catching one of each species, encouraging players to seek out particularly notable individuals. The size variation adds individuality to Pokemon within single species, making specific catches memorable beyond simple stat variations. A particularly large Wailord or tiny Joltik becomes a unique specimen worth keeping beyond competitive utility. Pumpkaboo and Gourgeist feature four distinct size categories that affect their stats and slightly alter their appearance. The size categories create form variation tied directly to gameplay effect rather than purely cosmetic differences. Players hunting for specific size Pumpkaboo must check multiple wild encounters to find desired sizes since the size locks upon catch and cannot change. This hunt creates additional collection goals while tying form variation to mechanical variation in ways most size differences don't. Height and weight measurements in Pokédex entries sometimes seem implausible when compared to battle depictions or anime appearances, creating disconnect between stated sizes and visual representation. Charizard stands 5'7" according to Pokédex data, but appears much larger in most media depictions. Wailord's density calculations, that's based on listed height and weight, suggest it would float in air rather than water. These inconsistencies become points of community humor rather than serious complaints, acknowledged as gameplay and design decisions rather than attempts at physical realism. Size variation in Legends Arceus extends to alpha Pokemon's obviously larger models and general population variation in standard wild specimens. This visual diversity makes environments feel more natural compared to previous games where all wild Pokemon of a species appeared identical. The variation affects gameplay through different hitboxes and detection ranges, creating mechanical consequences for size beyond pure aesthetics. This implementation suggests size variation might feature more prominently in future games if Legends Arceus's approach influences main series design philosophy moving forward. And as the categories unfold and overlap, finding distinctions that matter while acknowledging the boundaries remain permeable and context dependent. The classifications serve understanding rather than restricting imagination about what Pokemon can be. Every category emerged from patterns observed across hundreds of species, attempts to organize and comprehend the vast diversity the series has generated across nearly 3 decades. The categories succeed not through rigid boundaries, but through useful approximations that help players navigate overwhelming variety with terms that communicate quickly and accurately enough for practical purposes. Some Pokemon resist categorization entirely, existing between or outside established groups. Ditto transforms into other Pokemon, but isn't a form-changing Pokemon in the same sense as Rotom or Castform. Smeargle learns any move, but isn't technically related to Move Tutor or TM-based learning systems. These edge cases prove that categories describe general patterns rather than prescribe absolute rules. The classification systems remain flexible enough to accommodate exceptions while maintaining utility for discussing the majority of cases that fit established patterns. The categories themselves evolve as new generations introduce mechanics and species that challenge previous assumptions. Form differences expanded from simple aesthetics to type-changing transformations. Regional variance questioned whether species identity remains constant across geographic separation. Paradox Pokémon introduced temporal displacement as a categorization axis. Each generation potentially introduces new categorical thinking while maintaining enough continuity that previous categories remain useful for older content. This evolutionary approach to classification mirrors the evolutionary nature of Pokémon themselves, adapting and changing while maintaining core identity. Players create their own categories through community consensus around patterns Game Freak never officially designated. Pseudo-Legendary exists entirely within community vocabulary, despite clear patterns supporting the designation. Regional birds and regional rodents describe early root encounters that follow templates across generations without official category names. These community categories demonstrate player engagement with design patterns and willingness to create organizing frameworks that enhance discussion and understanding. The unofficial nature doesn't diminish their utility in communication and analysis. Competitive play develops its own categorical thinking around roles and functions rather than species traits or design patterns. Sweepers, walls, pivots, and support Pokemon form categories based on battle function rather than inherent characteristics. A Pokemon might fit multiple categories depending on movesets and stat investment, or shift categories between generations as metagames evolve and new options appear. These functional categories coexist with species-based categories without contradiction, serving different analytical purposes for different audiences with different priorities. The boundaries between categories sometimes matter intensely for specific gameplay purposes while remaining irrelevant for others. Whether Ultra Beasts count as legendaries affects their legality in certain competitive formats, but means nothing for casual playthrough team building. Whether baby Pokemon can breed determines breeding strategies, but doesn't affect their utility in battle. The context determines which categories matter and which remain trivia, with different players prioritizing different categorical distinctions based on their engagement with the game. Collection goals often center around completing specific categories rather than obtaining every Pokemon. A player might focus on collecting all shiny Pokemon within a specific generation, or all regional variants of a single species, or all legendary Pokemon across all games. These category-focused collections create achievable goals from the overwhelming prospect of completing a national Pokédex across multiple generations. The categories provide structure that makes collection feel purposeful rather than arbitrary, with completion thresholds that feel meaningful rather than simply numerous. Some categories exist primarily in specific games or mechanics rather than as universal distinctions. Totem Pokemon only exist in Generation 7. Shadow Pokemon appear only in Colosseum and XD. Alpha Pokemon belong exclusively to Legends Arceus. These game-specific categories create mechanical and narrative identity for specific titles rather than franchise-wide classifications. They demonstrate that categories can serve temporary purposes tied to specific design goals rather than requiring permanent implementation across all future entries. The intersection of multiple categories creates increasingly specific designations that apply to very few Pokemon. Legendary Paradox Pokémon describes only Koraidon and Miraidon. Mythical Pokémon that can evolve describes only Meltan and Melmetal. Starter Pokémon with split evolutions doesn't exist as a category, because no starter has ever featured branching evolution paths. These intersections reveal gaps in the design space where certain combinations remain unexplored, either by deliberate choice or simple happenstance across the series' history. Predicting future categories based on past patterns becomes a community activity with each new generation's announcement. Speculation about which Pokemon will fill the pseudo-legendary slot begins immediately upon region reveal. Players theorize about new transformation mechanics that might replace or supplement previous generation innovations. This predictive engagement demonstrates deep familiarity with the series' design patterns and creates anticipation beyond simple excitement for new Pokemon. The pattern recognition itself becomes entertainment and community bonding. Category subversion creates memorable exceptions that gain notoriety through breaking expected patterns. Alolan Persian subverts the regional form assumption that alternate forms improve or refine the original design, instead, creating a widely mocked appearance. Inamoris joining the Forces of Nature trio turned it into a quartet, breaking the trio naming convention retroactively. These subversions generate discussion and sometimes controversy, proving the categories matter enough that breaking them creates impact beyond simple surprise. The categories serve educational purposes for new players overwhelmed by hundreds of Pokemon species without clear organizing principles. Understanding that starter Pokemon follow specific patterns helps new players make informed decisions about their first choice. Knowing that legendary Pokemon typically can't breed explains why certain catches cannot produce eggs. The categories provide frameworks that accelerate learning and reduce confusion during early gameplay when everything feels unfamiliar and potentially significant. As categories accumulate across generations, the knowledge required to understand all distinctions grows beyond casual player engagement. Differentiating between legendary, mythical, and ultra beast categories requires specific knowledge of acquisition methods and official classifications that newer or casual players might not possess. This growing complexity creates expertise gradients within the player community, where dedicated players accumulate categorical knowledge that becomes social currency in discussions and content creation. The official silence on some categories creates ambiguity that fuels discussion and debate. Without official pseudo-legendary designation, players argue about whether specific Pokemon meet the criteria based on different interpretations of the informal requirements. The lack of clear official boundaries allows the community to debate and establish their own consensus while maintaining plausible alternative interpretations. This ambiguity creates engagement through unresolved questions rather than definitive answers. Documentation projects cataloging categories, and their members become community resources that players reference when building teams or completing collections. These fan-created databases organize information more accessibly than official sources, creating value through curation and presentation rather than original information. The documentation demonstrates community investment in understanding and organizing Pokemon beyond simple gameplay, treating the creature collection as a taxonomy worthy of serious study and systematic organization. The categories interact with narrative themes in ways that reinforce or contradict story elements. Legendary Pokemon's godlike power in lore contrasts with their capture and combat deployment in gameplay, creating ludonarrative dissonance that players either ignore or incorporate into headcanon. Mythical Pokemon's event-exclusive distribution reinforces their mysterious rare status narratively while creating frustration mechanically. The categories serve both gameplay and storytelling purposes, with varying degrees of harmony between those functions. As time passes and more generations accumulate, certain categories become historical rather than active parts of current gameplay. Mega Evolution exists in older games, but not newer ones, creating a category that matters for historical content, but not current releases. This temporal layering adds complexity to discussions that must specify which generation's mechanics apply to categorical understanding. The categories evolve from current gameplay elements to historical artifacts as the series moves forward, creating a rich but increasingly complex categorical history. The categories ultimately serve player needs for organization, discussion, and understanding rather than existing as inherent properties of Pokemon themselves. They represent human attempts to impose order on creative work that doesn't follow strict taxonomic rules. The categories succeed when they help players navigate the vast collection of Pokemon species, and they fail when they create confusion or restrict thinking about what Pokemon can be. This pragmatic approach to categorization keeps the system flexible enough to accommodate the series' continued evolution and growth. Some Pokemon challenge multiple categories simultaneously, creating cascade effects where addressing one classification creates questions about others. Silvally possesses traits of synthetic Pokemon, form changing Pokemon, and type shifting Pokemon simultaneously. These multi categorical Pokemon demonstrate the limits of discrete classification systems when confronting deliberate design choices that blend or transcend single categories. The existence of such edge cases prevents categorical thinking from becoming overly rigid or prescriptive about what Pokemon must be. Artistic choices in Pokemon design sometimes create categorical ambiguity that spawns fan theories and discussions. Whether Raichu and Pikachu's relationship constitutes true evolution or simply growth and aging remains debatable given the electrical theme and storage capacity metaphor. Whether Nidorina and Nidoqueen's inability to breed represents a biological reality or simply game design limitation divides interpretations. These ambiguities create space for players to engage critically with the game's systems rather than simply accepting them as given facts. The categories provide vocabulary for discussing Pokemon design patterns across generations, enabling analysis of how the series' approach to creature creation has evolved over time. Generation 1's limited type combinations expanded dramatically by Generation 5. Early generations' simpler designs gave way to more complex and detailed creatures in later releases. Tracking these changes requires categorical language that describes patterns rather than individual cases, demonstrating the analytical utility of classification systems beyond simple organization. Cultural differences in how players engage with categories reflect broader gaming culture variations across regions. Japanese players might prioritize different categorical distinctions than Western players based on familiarity with cultural references embedded in designs. Competitive players focus on battle-relevant categories, while collectors prioritize acquisition-based classifications. These cultural and personal variations in categorical thinking demonstrate that classification serves individual needs rather than universal truths, maintaining flexibility across diverse player populations. The categories interweave and support each other, creating a network of understanding rather than isolated bins for sorting Pokemon. Understanding baby Pokemon requires understanding breeding mechanics and evolution. Comprehending regional forms necessitates knowing original forms. Grasping pseudo-legendary status demands familiarity with legendary Pokemon and stat distributions. This interconnected categorical understanding builds holistically rather than sequentially, with each new category enriching comprehension of previously learned classifications. Future generations will inevitably introduce new categories or expand existing ones in ways current players cannot predict. The introduction of Gigantamax demonstrated that transformation categories could exist alongside other transformation systems. Paradox Pokémon showed temporal displacement could create distinct categories. Whatever Generation 10 introduces might establish entirely new classificatory axes that current categorical thinking doesn't anticipate. The openness to new categories keeps the series fresh while challenging players to expand their understanding rather than simply applying existing frameworks to new content. And as the night deepens and these categorical distinctions blur into broader understanding, the classifications fade from focus while the creatures themselves remain. Every category exists to serve appreciation and comprehension of Pokemon as a creative work rather than as an end in itself. The distinctions help navigate vast diversity without replacing the fundamental appeal of individual designs and personalities. Categories organize but don't define, describe but don't prescribe, and ultimately exist to enhance rather than restrict engagement with the countless creatures that have emerged across this long-running series. The patterns continue unfolding, gentle and inevitable, each category revealing new dimensions of understanding while maintaining connections to everything learned before. The web of classifications grows denser with each examination, threads linking disparate concepts through shared traits and complementary distinctions. Convergent evolution as a categorical concept extends beyond the specific wiglet and toadstool examples to represent a broader design philosophy about similarity without kinship. The category acknowledges that nature and design both produce parallel solutions to similar problems through independent processes. This recognition adds sophistication to discussions of Pokemon variation, distinguishing superficial resemblance from actual genetic relationship. The category creates space for deliberate visual echoes without requiring lore based explanations for why unrelated species look similar. The convergent species category remains small compared to other classifications, with only a handful of examples across Generation 9. This limited implementation suggests either caution about overusing the concept or difficulty finding appropriate species pairs that work well as convergent examples. The category's existence proves the concept viable, while its limited application shows restraint in deployment. Future generations might expand convergent species significantly, or leave it as a generation specific experiment that introduced an idea without committing to extensive implementation. Gender differences within the species create a subtle category that crosses all other classifications, appearing in baby Pokemon, legendaries, starters, and common species alike. The differences range from barely perceptible to dramatic, with no clear pattern determining which species receive notable sexual dimorphism and which remain identical across genders. Hippopotas and Hippowton feature complete color swaps between males and females, creating essentially two different color schemes for the same species. These extreme differences make gender a significant consideration when choosing which specimen to use, particularly for players with strong aesthetic preferences. Some gender differences reflect real-world sexual dimorphism in the species that inspired the Pokemon design. Pyro-R males possess elaborate manes, while females have sleeker profiles, mirroring lion sexual dimorphism. Meowstic males and females have completely different color schemes and slightly different stat distributions, reflecting the design's emphasis on gender as a defining trait. These biologically informed differences add naturalistic detail that rewards player knowledge of real-world animals while creating gameplay variety through subtle mechanical differences. The decision to include or exclude gender differences seems arbitrary from outside the design process, with some species that might logically feature dimorphism remaining identical across genders, while others with less obvious justification receive distinct forms. This arbitrariness suggests gender differences result from individual designer choices rather than systematic application of rules. The inconsistency adds variety while preventing the system from becoming predictable or mandatory for every species. Players cannot assume gender will matter for any particular species without checking. Genderless Pokemon form their own category, unable to breed except with Ditto, and lacking the sexual dimorphism that affects gendered species. This category spans legendary Pokemon, artificial creations, and species with reproduction methods that don't require sexual differentiation. Magnemite, Beldum, and Bronzor represent inorganic or artificial Pokemon where gender doesn't apply conceptually. Legendary trios often appear as genderless, reinforcing their mythological status and removing them from normal reproductive processes. The genderless category creates mechanical restrictions around breeding while supporting narrative choices about which Pokemon exist outside normal biological categories. The mechanical impact of genderless status primarily affects breeding programs, requiring Ditto as a universal breeding partner for species that cannot breed with each other or themselves. This requirement makes Ditto essential for completing breeding-based objectives with genderless species. Certain gender-specific evolution requirements become impossible for genderless lines, creating absolute barriers that no amount of gameplay can overcome. Galad cannot exist from a genderless Ralts, because Ralts must be male to become Galad. These hard limitations demonstrate how categorical membership creates concrete gameplay consequences beyond simple taxonomy. Mythical Pokemon's recent shift toward the in-game availability in Generation 9 represents a significant categorical evolution after decades of event-exclusive distribution. Petulant became available through special research in the Indigo Disc DLC rather than requiring external distribution events. This change addresses long-standing criticism about limited-time exclusives, creating permanent gaps in collections for players who missed events or lacked access to distribution methods. The shift toward in-game availability maintains mythical status through special acquisition requirements while removing time pressure and regional restrictions that made previous mythical Pokemon frustrating to obtain. The event distribution model for mythical Pokemon created artificial scarcity that benefited marketing but harmed player experience for those unable to participate. Regional distribution limitations meant certain areas never received certain mythical Pokemon, creating permanent collection gaps for players in those regions. Time-limited distribution windows meant players who discovered the series after events concluded could never legitimately obtain older mythical Pokemon without trading. These factors combined to make mythical completion among the most difficult collection goals, dependent on factors completely outside player control. The move toward in-game mythical availability might diminish their perceived rarity and special status, with the category becoming less distinct from legendary Pokemon if acquisition methods converge. Alternatively, the change might strengthen the category by making it about inherent traits rather than distribution method, focusing on the Pokemon themselves rather than how players obtained them. This categorical evolution demonstrates how classifications can shift meaning over time as design philosophies change and player expectations evolve. The mythical category remains in transition, with its future meaning unclear as newer titles implement different acquisition approaches. Signature moves create an informal category of Pokemon, defined by exclusive techniques that only they can learn. These moves often define the Pokemon's identity and competitive niche more strongly than stats or typing alone. Lucario's Aura Sphere, Greninja's Water Shuriken, and Urshifu's Wicked Blow and Surging Strikes all function as signature moves that establish unique identity. The exclusivity makes these Pokemon memorable beyond their appearance, tying mechanical distinction to specific species in ways that pure stat distribution cannot achieve. Some signature moves eventually become available to other Pokemon through Move Tutor expansion or new species introduction, diluting the original signature status. Aura Spheres spread to several fighting-type Pokemon after Lucario's introduction, though it remains associated primarily with Lucario in player consciousness. This expansion improves competitive diversity by allowing multiple Pokemon to fulfill similar roles, but it reduces the mechanical uniqueness that made signature moves special. The tension between exclusivity and distribution reveals competing design goals around species identity versus team-building flexibility. The signature ability category parallels signature moves, with certain abilities appearing only on specific Pokemon or evolutionary lines. Shedinja's Wonder Guard creates absolute mechanical uniqueness, making Shedinja play unlike any other Pokemon in existence. Slaking's Truant ability defines its competitive identity completely, creating a powerful Pokemon held back by a crippling drawback. These signature abilities create mechanical identities that transcend simple stats, making the Pokemon memorable and strategically distinct, regardless of competitive viability. The abilities become inseparable from the Pokemon that possess them, defining them more completely than any other single trait. Weather-dependent Pokemon form an informal category of species whose abilities or forms change based on weather conditions. Cast form shifts form and type based on active weather, becoming a pure normal type in clear conditions and gaining water, fire, or ice typing in rain, harsh sunlight, or hail, respectively. This weather dependency creates a Pokemon whose identity shifts with battlefield conditions, making it highly adaptable but also dependent on specific team compositions or luck with weather effects. The category includes relatively few members, with cast form being the most prominent example and other weather-influenced Pokemon changing less dramatically. Cherrim demonstrates a different weather-dependent approach, changing between closed and open flower forms based on harsh sunlight presence. This transformation affects stats and appearance without changing type, creating a more subtle weather dependency than cast form's complete type shift. The opened form provides significant stat improvements, making Cherrim viable primarily in sun-focused teams where its transformation can activate reliably. This conditional viability creates interesting team-building constraints where Cherrim functions well in specific contexts but struggles outside its optimal conditions. Weather dependency interacts with weather setting abilities and moves, creating synergies that reward dedicated weather team construction. Pokemon with drought or drizzle abilities guarantee weather conditions that benefit weather-dependent partners, creating reliable strategies around conditional transformations. This synergy makes weather teams a distinct competitive archetype where species selection focuses on weather activation and exploitation. The category demonstrates how abilities and forms can create strategic depth that extends beyond individual Pokemon to team composition and battlefield control. Extinct Pokemon form a narrative category separate from fossil Pokemon despite significant overlap. Fossil Pokemon represent extinct species through game mechanics, but lore-based extinction extends to species that went extinct in the Pokemon world without requiring resurrection. Paradox Pokemon's ancient forms represent extinct evolutionary branches, despite being obtainable through time displacement rather than fossils. This distinction separates mechanical extinction, requiring resurrection, from narrative extinction that creates backstory without limiting availability. The concept of extinction adds gravitas to certain Pokemon, suggesting they represent preserved remnants of lost ecosystems or evolutionary dead ends. Relicanth's existence as a living fossil creates narrative tension between its ancient lineage and current existence as a catchable species. The Coelacanth inspiration reinforces this living fossil concept, mirroring real-world discoveries of species thought extinct. This blending of real paleontology with Pokemon lore creates educational opportunities while deepening world-building through temporal depth. Extinction as a concept introduces darker themes of loss and irreversibility into a series generally focused on discovery and growth. The fossil Pokemon's resurrection mechanics suggest that extinction can be reversed through technology, offering hope while acknowledging the tragedy of species loss. Paradox. Pokemon's temporal displacement offers a different take where extinct species never truly vanished, merely moved to different time periods. These varying approaches to extinction demonstrate different philosophical stances on loss, preservation, and the possibility of undoing past disasters. Domesticated Pokemon represent species particularly integrated into human society, though no official category designates this status. Species like Tauros, Miltank, and Wooloo clearly serve agricultural purposes within the Pokemon world, referenced in Pokédex entries and game environments. These utility Pokemon exist alongside combat-focused species, suggesting that not all Pokemon serve primarily as battle partners. The domesticated category acknowledges the economic and social functions Pokemon serve beyond the player's combat focused perspective. The domestication concept raises questions about Pokemon agency and the ethics of their integration into human economic systems. The series rarely addresses these questions directly, maintaining a generally optimistic tone about human Pokemon relationships. Pokedex entries sometimes reference Pokemon used for labor, transportation, or resource production without exploring the implications of such usage. This avoidance keeps the series family friendly while creating space for players to consider deeper questions if they choose. The domesticated category exists primarily in implication rather than explicit designation. Agricultural Pokemon like Miltank and Combi produce resources that humans harvest, creating utility beyond battle capability. This production creates value separate from competitive viability, though the games rarely mechanize resource gathering beyond berry farming. The concept of Pokemon producing valuable goods suggests economic systems built around Pokemon utility rather than combat. These systems remain largely background world building rather than gameplay mechanics, hinted at through Pokedex entries and NPC dialogue without becoming central to player experience. Transportation Pokemon traditionally included species like Lapras and Pidgeot through HM moves that enabled overworld travel. The removal of HMs in later generations shifted transportation to specific ride Pokemon or legendary Pokemon depending on game mechanics. This shift from player-chosen transportation to game-designated vehicles changed the relationship between Pokemon and utility, making specific species central to travel rather than allowing player choice. The transportation category evolved from flexible player decision to fixed game mechanic, changing how players interact with Pokemon as tools versus partners. Companion Pokemon represent species particularly associated with bonding and partnership rather than combat prowess. The Pikachu evolutionary line exemplifies this category through Pikachu's prominence as Ash's partner in the anime. Eevee serves a similar companion role, emphasized through Let's Go, Eevee's treatment of the species as a starter and constant partner. These companion-focused species often receive special forms, moves, or mechanics that reinforce their status as beloved partners, rather than simply powerful combatants. The category exists more strongly in supplementary media than in core game mechanics, though certain titles like Let's Go explicitly build around companion bonding. The affection and friendship mechanics, introduced across various generations, attempted to mechanize companion bonding, providing gameplay benefits for maintaining high friendship levels with team members. These systems reward player investment in specific Pokemon beyond simple level grinding, creating emotional attachment through mechanical interaction. The friendship evolution requirement for species like Golbat and Togepi enforces minimum bonding before evolution occurs, tying progression to relationship rather than pure experience gain. This mechanization of emotional connection serves gameplay purposes while reinforcing thematic elements about bonds between trainers and Pokemon. Amy, refresh, and camp mechanics across generations 3 through 8 provided mini-game opportunities to bond with Pokemon through feeding, playing, and caring activities. These systems existed separately from battle training, creating dedicated time for non-combat interaction. The mechanics never became mandatory, but offered benefits that encouraged engagement for players interested in optimizing battle performance. This optional depth allowed the games to support different play styles, with competitive players potentially ignoring affection systems, while casual players invested heavily in bonding activities. Starter Pokemon's role as first partners creates inherent companion status, regardless of species-specific traits. Players receive starters at Journey's beginning, creating a narrative of growing alongside their first Pokemon. This structure encourages emotional attachment through shared progression and first partner status. Many players maintain their starter on their team throughout the entire game, despite potentially having access to more powerful options, demonstrating that companionship value exceeds pure competitive utility for many players. The starter category combines companion aspects with combat functionality, serving both emotional and practical purposes simultaneously. The Pokédex itself functions as a categorical system, organizing species through numerical assignment that creates implicit hierarchies and relationships. Lower Pokédex numbers carry prestige and familiarity through earlier introduction, with Generation 1 Pokémon maintaining special status as the original 151. Regional Pokédex organization groups species by discovery order and habitat, creating different categorical frameworks than National Pokédex organization. These organizational systems shape player perception and discussion, with Pokédex numbers serving as shorthand identification more precise than species names for veteran players. Pokédex completion represents a major category-based goal, requiring obtaining every species within a specific organizational framework. National Pokédex completion across all generations represents the ultimate completion challenge, requiring hundreds of hours and often multiple game versions to achieve. Regional Pokédex completion offers more achievable goals scoped to specific games, encouraging completion without overwhelming new players with the full species list. The tiered approach to Pokédex goals creates multiple stopping points that feel like achievements rather than simply arbitrary percentages toward an enormous final goal. The living Pokédex concept emerged from community practices around maintaining one of every species in storage rather than simply registering them through temporary catches or trades. This collection approach treats Pokémon as preserved specimens rather than temporary registrations, creating a tangible collection that represents significantly more effort than simple Pokédex completion. Living Pokédex collectors must manage box space carefully and maintain organization systems that keep hundreds of species accessible and identifiable. The practice demonstrates dedication that exceeds normal completion goals, creating elite status within collector communities. Form completion extends Pokédex goals beyond species collection to include every form variant of form-changing species. This extension multiplies collection requirements for species with multiple forms, especially those with rare or difficult-to-obtain variants. Vivillon's form collection requires obtaining specimens from different real-world regions, creating collection challenges that extend outside single-game completion. Alchemy's 63 form combinations create an enormous collection challenge within a single species, requiring detailed guides and extensive planning to obtain every variant. Form completion represents the ultimate extension of collection goals, targeting absolute completeness rather than representative samples. Shiny Living Pokédex represents the theoretical ultimate collection goal, combining living Pokédex requirements with shiny hunting for every species. This goal requires thousands of hours minimum, potentially tens of thousands, for unlucky hunters pursuing full odds shinies for every species. Few players seriously attempt complete shiny living Pokédex goals, with most settling for shiny collections of favorite species or shiny versions of rare categories like legendary or mythical Pokémon. The goal exists more as theoretical aspiration than practical objective, representing the absolute ceiling of collection dedication. The category of route-specific Pokémon defines species by their encounter locations rather than inherent traits, creating geographic rather than biological classifications. Early route normal types like Rattata, Sentret, and Zigzagoon fill similar ecological niches across regions despite being different species. These early encounters introduce players to catching mechanics through common, accessible species that don't require special conditions or extensive searching. The category serves pedagogical purposes, teaching core mechanics before introducing complexity through rare species or special encounter conditions. Whilst late game rare encounters represent the opposite extreme, species available only in small areas or under specific conditions near game's conclusions. These rare spawns reward exploration and persistence while creating meaningful discoveries during late game exploration. Victory Road encounters traditionally feature powerful species that help prepare teams for Elite Four challenges, creating a late game power spike for players who invest in training newly caught species. The geographic specificity creates discovery moments that feel rewarding because of their rarity and timing, arriving when players possess the resources and knowledge to appreciate them. Version exclusive Pokemon create a categorical split based on game version rather than inherent traits or mechanics. These exclusives encourage trading between players with different versions while frustrating solo players attempting completion. The version exclusivity typically affects a small percentage of species per generation, creating gaps that require trading or purchasing multiple versions to fill. This marketing strategy successfully drives multiple version purchases and trading activity while creating artificial barriers to completion that serve business purposes more than gameplay ones. Exclusive legendary Pokemon to game versions create more significant collection barriers than common version exclusives, requiring either trading legendary specimens or purchasing both versions to obtain both box mascots. Players generally show more willingness to trade common version exclusives than legendary Pokemon, making legendary completion more difficult than standard Pokedex filling. The asymmetry creates value hierarchies in trading communities where legendary Pokemon command premium trades that common species cannot match. Post-game Pokemon define species by availability timing, rather than traits, appearing only after defeating Elite Four or completing main story progression. These species reward completion with new content while ensuring main story balance by excluding potentially overpowered options from early access. Legendary Pokemon often fall into this category, becoming accessible only after demonstrating sufficient skill to complete the main story. The post-game gating creates progression beyond the credits, extending gameplay for players who want to continue after the primary narrative concludes. Event-exclusive Pokemon form a category based entirely on distribution method rather than species traits, creating artificial rarity through controlled availability. These event Pokemon sometimes feature exclusive moves, ribbons, or other markers that distinguish them from standard specimens. The exclusivity creates prestige around event participation while frustrating players unable to attend events or access distributions. The category blurs with mythical Pokemon, but extends to any Pokemon distributed through events with special traits that make them distinct from normal catches. Colosseum and XD introduce a snag exclusive species obtainable only through purifying Shadow Pokemon, creating game-specific availability that doesn't transfer to main series encounter tables. These exclusive species gave the GameCube titles unique value beyond their story content, providing Pokemon unavailable in Game Boy Advance titles. The exclusivity encouraged players to engage with spin-off titles rather than dismissing them as non-essential, integrating them into broader collection goals. The distribution of exclusives across multiple game lines creates incentives to purchase titles beyond main series entries, expanding the franchise's reach. Seasonal availability creates time-based categories where certain Pokemon appear only during specific months or in-game seasons. Generation 5 introduced prominent seasonal variations, with species appearing exclusively in certain seasons. This time gating encourages long-term engagement, as players return across multiple months to complete seasonal Pokédex entries. The seasonal system rewards patience, while potentially frustrating players, unwilling to wait or unable to maintain access across multiple months. Time manipulation through system clock adjustment circumvents seasonal restrictions, but risks other consequences depending on game mechanics. Time of day encounters split species availability between day, night, and sometimes morning or evening periods, creating temporal rather than geographic restrictions. Nocturnal species like Hoothoot appear exclusively at night, while diurnal species dominate daytime encounters. This day night cycle creates naturalistic variation that rewards playing at different times while potentially excluding species from players with limited play schedules. The restriction adds immersion through realistic behavior patterns while creating mild inconvenience that most players solve through schedule adjustment or clock manipulation. Weather dependent encounters restrict species to specific weather conditions, creating environmental requirements beyond simple geographic location. Rain exclusive encounters like Lotad in specific areas require either luck with random weather or manipulation through save reloading. The weather dependency adds dynamism to encounter tables while creating frustration when desired weather conditions refuse to occur naturally. Weather locking creates immersion through environmental authenticity while highlighting the tension between realistic simulation and player convenience. Swarm encounters introduce daily rotating species that appear in specific locations only when designated as that day's swarm target. This rotation creates reliable but time-gated access to species otherwise unavailable or extremely rare. The daily swarm system encourages regular login patterns as players check for desired swarm targets. Swarm exclusivity for certain species creates completion barriers that resolve only through patient checking or consultation of external guides that predict swarm patterns. Honeytree encounters in Generation 4 exemplify patience testing availability, requiring players to slather trees with honey and wait real-world hours before returning to find encounters. The delay mechanic simulates baiting and waiting for wild creatures while creating tedious waiting periods that interrupt gameplay flow. Certain rare species like munchlax appear only in specific honey trees with very low encounter rates, creating extreme completion challenges that require both knowledge and luck. The honey tree system became notorious for frustrating encounter rates that tested player dedication severely. Safari Zone species create special encounter conditions where normal battle mechanics don't apply, using bait and rock mechanics instead of traditional weakening and catching strategies. The alternate catching rules and change optimal strategies significantly, with some species becoming easier or harder to catch depending on how Safari Zone mechanics interact with their catch rates. Safari Zone exclusives gave these areas special value beyond their mechanical novelty, creating collection incentives that drove engagement with potentially frustrating encounter rules. Great Marsh in Generation 4 added time and day rotation to Safari Zone mechanics, creating compound requirements where species appeared only in specific marsh areas during specific daily rotations. This layered restriction created severe completion challenges that required consulting external resources or extraordinary patience. The complexity demonstrated that adding layers of availability restrictions eventually creates more frustration than engagement, teaching design lessons about accessibility thresholds. Dreamworld species from Generation 5 created internet connectivity-based exclusives obtainable only through engaging with online services that no longer function. The service shutdown made these species permanently inaccessible through original methods requiring trades from players who obtained them before shutdown. This permanence demonstrates risks of tying Pokemon availability to temporary online services, creating frustration that persists years after original distribution. And as these categories compound and intersect, creating ever more specific descriptions of narrower Pokemon populations, the categorical thinking reaches its limits, where individual species become their own categories defined by unique combinations of traits. Every Pokemon exists at the intersection of multiple categories defined by compound membership rather than single classification. The categories serve understanding without constraining appreciation, organizing without restricting, describing patterns without prescribing limitations on what future Pokemon might become. They remain tools for thought rather than natural divisions, useful fictions that enhance engagement with creatures that transcend simple classification through their designed complexity and accumulated history across nearly 3 decades of franchise evolution. The evolution of categorical thinking across the franchise's history reveals changing priorities and design philosophies that shaped how Pokemon are conceived and organized. Early generations maintained relatively simple categorical boundaries with straightforward distinctions between basic evolutionary stages, legendary status, and type classifications. These foundational categories established frameworks that later generations would expand, complicate, and occasionally subvert through increasingly sophisticated design choices. The progression from simple to complex categories mirrors the franchise's maturation from straightforward creature collection to a nuanced system incorporating multiple progression paths and transformation mechanics. Generation 1 established baseline categories that would persist throughout the franchise while remaining deliberately simple in their implementation. Evolutionary stages, legendary status, and type-based organization provided sufficient framework for organizing the original 151 species. The simplicity served accessibility, allowing new players to grasp organizational principles without extensive tutorial or outside research. This foundational approach created room for future expansion while ensuring the core concepts remained comprehensible across different age groups and gaming experience levels. The categories functioned as training wheels that players could eventually discard once familiarity made explicit classification unnecessary. Generation 2's introduction of baby Pokemon represented the first major categorical expansion, adding retroactive complexity to evolutionary lines previously considered complete. This backwards expansion demonstrated willingness to revise established evolutionary families rather than treating Generation 1 Pokemon as immutable foundations. The breeding mechanics that accompanied baby Pokemon created an entire subsystem requiring new categorical understanding around egg groups, breeding compatibility, and inherited characteristics. This mechanical depth transformed breeding from simple offspring production into strategic planning around inherited moves, natures, and eventually individual values. The breeding system's complexity introduced categorical thinking around competitive viability and optimal specimen characteristics beyond simple species collection. Perfect individual value spreads became a category unto themselves, with competitive players distinguishing between Pokemon with ideal stats and those with suboptimal distributions. Nature categories emerged through the characteristic system, with 25 possible natures creating specialization options that fine-tuned stat distributions toward specific battle roles. These hidden categories existed beneath surface-level species classification, adding layers of optimization that casual players could ignore while providing depth for dedicated competitors. Egg groups themselves form a complex categorical web, determining which species can breed together, creating genetic compatibility charts that span types, body shapes, and conceptual similarities. The Water 1 group connects aquatic creatures with similar body structures, despite different types and evolutionary origins. The Field group encompasses terrestrial mammals and related creatures, creating breeding possibilities that sometimes seem improbable based on size or appearance differences. These egg group categories operate independently from type classifications, creating breeding possibilities that cross type boundaries while restricting others that might seem obvious based on superficial similarities. The undiscovered egg group functions as a breeding restriction category encompassing baby Pokemon, legendary species, and certain special categories like Ultra Beasts and Paradox Pokémon. This category's negative definition, characterized by what its members cannot do rather than shared positive traits, creates a catch all for Pokemon that shouldn't participate in normal breeding mechanics. The restriction maintains rarity and special status for legendary Pokemon while preventing exploitation of baby Pokemon's often favorable egg move inheritance before they mature into breeding capable stages. The undiscovered designation acknowledges that not all Pokemon fit into normal reproductive categories. Ditto's unique position as the universal breeding partner creates an exception based category where a single species breaks rules that constrain all others. This exceptional status makes Ditto essential for breeding programs despite its relatively unremarkable battle capabilities. The ability to breed with any gendered or genderless Pokemon, except those in the undiscovered group, positions Ditto as a taxonomic wildcard that enables completion goals otherwise blocked by single gender specimens or genderless species. The exception based functionality demonstrates that categories serve gameplay needs as much as logical consistency, with special cases introduced when normal rules create undesirable restrictions. The introduction of abilities in Generation 3 added another layer of categorical complexity, with each ability creating implicit categories of Pokemon sharing that trait. Hidden abilities expanded the system further, creating rare variants of standard species that became distinct categories within their species. A Froakie with Protean plays fundamentally differently from one with Torrent, creating strategic categorization based on ability access rather than species alone. The hidden ability system rewards dedicated breeding, friend safari hunting, or special distributions, creating tiered access that separates casual catches from optimized specimens. Ability categories emerged organically through competitive play, with players grouping Pokemon by shared abilities that enable specific strategies. Intimidate users form a competitive category valued for their ability to weaken physical attackers upon switching in. Speed boost users create another category capable of becoming progressively faster throughout battles. These ability based categories cross type and species boundaries, creating team building considerations that prioritize function over traditional categorical thinking about type coverage or evolutionary families. The strategic categories demonstrate how gameplay mechanics create organizational frameworks separate from inherent species traits. The concept of ability based competitive tiers evolved from community observation of which abilities dominated specific formats and power levels. Abilities like Huge Power or Pure Power immediately elevate species into higher competitive consideration regardless of base stats. Conversely, hindering abilities like Truant or Slow Start create strategic liabilities that drop species into lower tiers despite potentially strong stats. These informal tier categories, based on ability impact, demonstrate how categorical thinking extends beyond official classifications into community-generated organization systems based on competitive viability and strategic value. Signature abilities create the most exclusive ability-based categories, with single Pokemon or evolutionary families possessing unique traits unavailable elsewhere. Wonder Guard's damage immunity except from super effective hits creates Shedinja's entire competitive identity and strategic niche. Disguise's one-time protection grants Mimikyu exceptional versatility in setting up or trading hits safely. These signature abilities become inseparable from their Pokemon, defining them more completely than any other single characteristic and creating strategic identities that cannot be replicated or replaced by other species, regardless of stat distributions or move pools. The held item system introduced another dimension of categorical complexity through items that fundamentally change how certain Pokemon function or enable specific strategies. Choice items create a category of locked-in sweepers, sacrificing versatility for enhanced power or speed. Assault Vest users form a category of specially defensive Pokemon trading move flexibility for enhanced special bulk. These item enabled categories exist only in context of specific held items, with Pokemon entering or leaving categories based on their current equipment rather than inherent traits. The conditional nature of item based categories highlights how context determines categorization as much as fixed characteristics. Megastone holders formed a temporary category during Generation 6 and 7, distinguishing Pokemon capable of Mega Evolution from those lacking that potential. This category's game specific nature meant it existed strongly during certain generations before becoming legacy content in later releases. The temporary relevance demonstrates how categories can be essential for understanding certain game periods while becoming historical footnotes after mechanical changes remove their functional relevance. The Mega Evolution category persists in older games and specific remakes while vanishing from current main series releases, creating split categorical thinking depending on which game context is being discussed. Z Crystal compatibility created a similar temporary category in Generation 7, with species-specific Z crystals distinguishing certain Pokemon as recipients of unique signature Z moves. These exclusive Zig moves created brief moments of special status before Generation 8's removal of the mechanic relegated them to historical interest. The temporary nature of Zig move categories illustrates the franchise's pattern of introducing mechanics that create new categorical frameworks before abandoning them in favor of newer systems that require their own organizational structures. This churning categorical landscape requires players to maintain parallel understandings of different generation mechanics rather than accumulating comprehensive knowledge applicable across all releases. Dynamax and Gigantamax introduced Generation 8's categorical frameworks, with Gigantamax Factor creating a rare variant category within species capable of the transformation. The Factor's initial rarity made Gigantamax specimens distinctly valuable compared to standard individuals of the same species. Max Soup's introduction democratized access while maintaining categorical distinction through the special preparation required to enable Gigantamax. The temporary nature of Dynamax transformation itself meant the category mattered only during specific battle conditions and in specific battle formats, creating highly contextual categorization that applied situationally rather than permanently. Terra types in Generation 9 introduced the most flexible categorical framework yet, with every Pokemon possessing an inherent Terra type that could be changed through special items and processes. This flexibility meant Terra type categories remained fluid rather than fixed, with players able to customize their Pokemon's Terra type to suit team strategies or coverage needs. The Terra type system created micro-categories within species, with Garchomp possessing Fire Terra type functioning differently from one with Steel or Ghost Terra types. This within-species variation multiplied strategic options while creating organizational challenges for discussions about optimal builds and competitive usage. The evolution of transformation mechanics from Mega Evolution through Z moves to Dynamax, and finally Terrestrialization, demonstrates a design philosophy of introducing generation-specific gimmicks that create temporary categorical frameworks before replacement by newer systems. This approach ensures each generation feels mechanically distinct while creating discontinuity that frustrates players who invested in mastering previous systems. The categorical thinking required constantly updates to accommodate new transformation mechanics while maintaining understanding of legacy systems for playing older games or discussing franchise history comprehensively. The continuous evolution prevents categorical ossification while requiring ongoing learning from dedicated players. Move categories beyond basic type classification create organizational frameworks around physical versus special damage split, priority tiers, and affect categories like entry hazards or field effects. The physical special split in Generation 4 reorganized entire type categories, changing Dark and Ghost from special to physical typing considerations, and vice versa for fighting and bug. This mechanical overhaul required categorical rethinking about which Pokemon benefited from which stats, creating winners and losers through pure mechanical reclassification without changing any Pokemon's inherent design. The split demonstrated how categorical frameworks themselves could evolve in ways that dramatically affected existing content. Priority move users form a tactical category valued for their ability to move first, regardless of speed stats, creating strategies around preserving low health sweepers or picking off weakened opponents before they can move. Different priority tiers create subcategories, with +2 priority like extreme speed outpacing, +1 priority like quick attack. These granular priority distinctions matter intensely in competitive play, while remaining largely invisible to casual players, demonstrating how categories serve different audiences with different needs. The priority system creates depth that rewards system mastery while not preventing casual enjoyment for players who ignore these strategic nuances entirely. Entry hazard setters form a competitive category essential for chip damage strategies that wear down opposing teams across multiple switches. Stealth Rock setters occupy the most valuable hazard setting niche due to Stealth Rock's universal effectiveness and heavy damage against flying and fire types. Spikes and Toxic Spikes setters provide alternative hazard options with different strategic profiles. The hazard setting category crosses types and roles, with defensive walls and offensive leads, both potentially filling hazard setting duties depending on team strategy and format requirements. The functional category demonstrates how competitive roles create organizational thinking separate from traditional species based classification. Status move categories encompass paralysis, sleep, burn, freeze, and poison effects, with Pokemon specializing in inflicting specific statuses, forming tactical groupings. Thunderwave users form a paralysis focused category, valuable for speed control. Will-O-Wisp users create burn-focused strategies that neuter physical attackers. Sleep inducers fill the most controversial status category, with Sleep's battle-ending potential creating power-level concerns across multiple generations. These status specializations create team-building considerations around which status effects best suit overall strategy, with choices affecting team composition beyond simple type coverage calculations. Weather setters form one of the most strategically significant categories, with abilities that automatically initiate weather conditions upon switching in. Drought, drizzle, sandstream, and snow warning users each enable entirely different team archetypes built around exploiting specific weather conditions. The automatic activation makes these ability holders essential anchors for weather teams, creating premium value around specific species regardless of their individual combat capabilities. A Pokemon with weather setting abilities becomes valuable primarily for enabling teammate strategies rather than its own offensive or defensive merits, demonstrating how support capabilities create value beyond personal battle strength. Terrain setters introduced another field condition category with Generation 6's Fairy Terrain and Generation 7's expansion to include Psychic, Electric, and Grassy terrains. These terrain effects create field control strategies, distinct from weather teams while serving similar team-enabling functions. Terrain users gained prominence in Generation 8 through terrain's increased importance in Dynamax metagames. The terrain setting category created new team archetypes while maintaining structural similarities to weather teams, demonstrating how new mechanics can create parallel categories that fill similar strategic roles while offering distinct gameplay experiences. Trick Room enablers form a speed inversion category valued for their ability to reverse speed priorities, making slow Pokemon move first. This anti-speed strategy creates team archetypes entirely around slow, powerful Pokemon that would normally suffer from moving last. Trick Room setters need bulk to survive long enough to activate the room, creating selection pressure toward defensive Pokemon with access to the move. The strategy's specific requirements create a well-defined category of viable Trick Room users, despite the move's relatively wide distribution, with success depending on bulk and typing as much as move access alone. Baton Pass chains represented a controversial category where teams passed stat boosts between members to create overwhelming threats through accumulated buffs. The strategy's extreme power led to significant competitive restrictions and eventual banning in many formats. The Baton Pass category demonstrated how some strategic categories become problematic enough to require categorical prohibition, rather than simply falling out of favor through metagame adaptation. The restriction created negative categories of banned strategies and restricted Pokemon combinations, adding another layer of categorical thinking around what is permitted versus forbidden in specific competitive contexts. Evasion strategies form another controversial category often restricted in competitive play due to luck-based mechanics and potential to create unwinnable situations through chained evasion boosts. The casual versus competitive divide around evasion strategies highlights how different play contexts create different attitudes toward specific categories. Casual players might enjoy evasion strategies' chaos and unexpected outcomes, while competitive players reject the reduced skill expression and increased luck dependency. These context-dependent attitudes demonstrate that categorical value isn't inherent, but varies based on what players prioritize in their Pokemon experience. OHKO move users form a category of high-risk, high-reward Pokemon capable of instantly defeating opponents through moves like Sheer Cold or Fissure. The low accuracy and immunity-based restrictions create unreliable strategies that nonetheless offer potential for instant elimination of threats, regardless of stat differences or type advantages. The category exists primarily in casual play, with most competitive formats banning OHKO moves entirely due to their luck-based mechanics. The competitive restrictions create another instance where categories valued in casual contexts become prohibited in serious competition, demonstrating divergent evolutionary paths for how different audiences approach the same game systems. Stall teams created a strategic category focused on outlasting opponents through passive damage, healing, and status effects rather than direct combat. These teams prize defensive capabilities, recovery moves, and chip damage from entry hazards or status conditions. The stall archetype represents an extreme strategic specialization that dominates matchups against unprepared opponents while struggling against dedicated stall breakers or aggressive hyper-offense teams. The archetype's polarizing nature creates strong opinions within competitive communities, with some players appreciating strategic depth while others find the long battles tedious and frustrating. Hyper-offense teams represent the opposite extreme from stall, prioritizing overwhelming offensive pressure that defeats opponents before they can establish defensive positions. These teams prize speed, power, and coverage, sacrificing defensive stability for explosive offensive potential. The hyper-offense category succeeds through momentum and early game dominance, ending battles quickly when successful, but collapsing rapidly when initial pressure fails to break through opponent defenses. The high variance, short battle nature appeals to players who value action and decisive outcomes over incremental advantage accumulation through long, strategic battles. Balanced teams occupy the strategic middle ground, incorporating offensive and defensive elements without extreme specialization in either direction. These teams adapt to various opponent strategies through versatile team members capable of filling multiple roles as matchups demand. The balanced category represents conservative team building that sacrifices both stalls' defensive peaks and hyper-offense's explosive potential for consistent performance across diverse matchups. Many players gravitate toward balanced teams as reliable starting points before potentially specializing toward stall or offense as they develop stronger preferences and strategic identities. Monotype teams create self imposed restriction categories where all team members share a single type, despite the strategic disadvantages this creates. These teams require deep knowledge of chosen types to succeed despite shared weaknesses that opponents can exploit systematically. Monotype represents challenge seeking categorization, where players voluntarily accept handicaps to demonstrate mastery and creative team building within narrow constraints. The self imposed limitation creates pride in success that exceeds achievements with unrestricted team building, with the category existing primarily in dedicated monotype competitive formats or personal challenge runs. Nuzlocke runs create player-imposed categorical frameworks around permadeath and restricted catching rules, transforming casual playthroughs into high-stakes challenges. These self-imposed restriction categories emerged entirely from player communities rather than official game mechanics, demonstrating how players generate organizational frameworks that serve their engagement preferences. The Nuzlocke category has spawned numerous variations and subcategories, with different rules creating distinct challenge profiles and gameplay experiences. This player driven categorical explosion demonstrates creative engagement with game systems that extends far beyond developer intended structures. Speedrun categories create competitive frameworks around completing games as quickly as possible under specific rule sets, with any percent, 100%, and glitchless categories representing the most common divisions. These time based categories prioritize efficiency and execution over traditional measures, like team strength or Pokedex completion. The speedrun community's extensive subcategories, including individual generation speedruns and specific challenge categories like Professor Oak challenges, demonstrate how dedicated communities create elaborate categorical structures that serve their specific interests and competitive frameworks. Shiny only challenges represent another player imposed category where teams consist exclusively of shiny Pokemon, combining collection dedication with gameplay challenge. The extreme rarity of shiny Pokemon makes team assembly the primary challenge rather than team battling, creating a category where preparation vastly exceeds execution in terms of time investment. These challenges appeal to players who value collection achievement and aesthetic preference over strategic optimization, demonstrating how different player priorities create entirely different engagement frameworks within the same game systems. Competitive tiers form perhaps the most elaborate sub-player generated categorical framework, with Smogon's tier system organizing Pokemon into usage-based categories from overused down through rarely used to never used and below. These tiers emerge from usage statistics rather than predetermined classifications, creating organic categories that shift as metagames evolve and player preferences change. The tier system enables balanced competition across power levels by restricting higher tier Pokemon from lower tier formats, creating multiple competitive ecosystems within a single generation rather than a single unified metagame dominated by the strongest available species. Uber's tier represents the highest competitive category, encompassing legendary Pokemon and species deemed too powerful for standard overused play. This ban list category creates space for balanced standard play while acknowledging that some Pokemon exceed power levels compatible with diverse competitive environments. The Ubers category itself developed competitive play rather than functioning purely as a ban list, creating a legendary-focused metagame with its own strategic depth and team-building requirements. This evolution from ban list to legitimate format demonstrates how categories can develop functions beyond their original purposes through community engagement and creative adaptation. The Little Cup creates a competitive category restricted to unevolved Pokemon, typically at level 5, creating a metagame focused on first evolutionary stages. This format highlights species that might be evolutionary stepping stones in standard play, creating competitive contexts where their power levels and move pools can shine, without comparison to evolved forms. Little Cup demonstrates how restriction categories create diversity by elevating species that would never see use in unrestricted formats, creating value in breadth of roster rather than only focusing on highest power levels available. Battle facilities like Battle Tower, Battle Frontier, and Battle Tree create specialized competitive categories with unique rule sets and AI opponents designed to challenge players differently from standard trainer battles or player versus player competition. These facilities often restrict legendary Pokemon or impose other limitations that create distinct team building requirements from unrestricted play. The rental Pokemon categories within some facilities further restrict player choice to predetermined sets, testing strategic decision making and adaptation rather than team preparation. These facility specific categories create variety within single player competitive challenge, extending post game engagement beyond online battling or collection completion. Rotation battles and triple battles introduced alternative battle formats that created tactical categories around positioning and switching strategies, distinct from standard singles or doubles formats. These formats enjoyed brief prominence before being removed from main series games, creating yet another instance of temporary categories that matter intensely during their active periods before becoming historical footnotes. The format-specific strategies and team composition requirements demonstrate how battle format itself functions as a categorical framework determining which Pokemon and strategies find value. Double battles created perhaps the most significant format category, with doubles requiring different team composition and strategic thinking compared to singles battles. The simultaneous presence of 2 active Pokemon per side creates synergy opportunities and targeting decisions absent from singles format, protects increased value in doubles, creates categorical thinking around which Pokemon benefit most from the move's defensive utility. Spread move users gain prominence through their ability to damage multiple opponents simultaneously. These format-specific considerations mean that competitive viability becomes format-dependent, with some Pokemon excelling in doubles while struggling in singles and vice versa. VGC's official doubles format created a competitive category distinct from community-run singles formats, with different ban lists, legendary restrictions, and metagame development separate from Smogon tiers. The format's official status and tournament support gave it legitimacy and prominence that influenced game balance decisions in ways that community formats did not. VGC-specific restricted formats allowing certain legendary Pokemon created yet another categorical framework where legendary usage became strategic choice rather than universal inclusion or ban. The restricted format's allowance of 2 restricted Pokemon per team created team-building categories around restricted pairs and their support structures. The concept of restricted Pokemon itself created a middle ground between universal legendary bans and unrestricted formats, acknowledging that some legendary Pokemon balanced adequately in formats where their power level becomes expected baseline rather than overwhelming advantage. This nuanced approach to legendary inclusion demonstrates categorical thinking that moves beyond binary ban or allow decisions toward graduated restriction systems that enable legendary use within structured limits. The restricted category shows sophisticated engagement with power level concerns that creates competitive diversity through carefully designed allowances rather than blanket prohibitions. Damage calculation categories emerged from the community through detailed analysis of how damage formulas work and which stat investments achieve specific KO thresholds. OHKO threats form a category of Pokemon capable of eliminating common threats in a single hit prioritizing offensive stats and super effective coverage. Two hit KO math creates different team building priorities around sustaining initial hits while securing KOs across 2 turns. These damage focused categories demonstrate how technical understanding of game mechanics creates strategic frameworks that competitive players use for team optimization, even though casual players might never consider such detailed calculations. Bulk categories emerged from similar technical analysis, with specially defensive walls and physically defensive walls forming distinct categories based on defensive stat distributions and typing. Mixed bulk users, rare enough to form their own subcategory, with species like Toxapex achieving high effectiveness against both physical and special attackers. The bulk categories drive team composition toward ensuring adequate defensive coverage against diverse offensive threats, creating strategic balance requirements that prevent purely offensive team construction from achieving consistent success against prepared opponents. Recovery move users form a crucial category for sustained battles, with reliable recovery like Roost or Recover enabling defensive strategies that would fail without healing capabilities. The recovery category's prominence in stall teams demonstrates how sustained capabilities become prerequisites for specific archetypes, creating mandatory team building requirements around which species can fulfill defensive roles effectively. Recovery move distribution thus becomes a significant categorical factor, determining competitive viability for defensive species, with those lacking reliable recovery struggling to maintain defensive utility across extended battles. Pivot moves like U-turn, volt switch, and in flip turn created a mobility category valued for maintaining offensive momentum while scouting opponent switches. The pivot category enables aggressive playstyles that apply constant pressure while preserving switch advantage through dealing damage while simultaneously switching. This mechanical advantage makes pivot users valuable across diverse team archetypes, with even defensive teams appreciating the momentum preservation that pivoting provides. The category's broad utility demonstrates how certain move types transcend specific strategic frameworks to provide universal value across different approaches to team construction and battle strategy. Setup sweeper categories organize around stat-boosting moves that enable progressive strengthening until Pokémon become overwhelming threats. Dragon Dance users form a physical setup category, Calm Mind users focus on special setup, and Shell Smash users sacrifice defenses for exceptional offensive boosting. These setup categories require specific team support to function effectively, with entry hazard removal and speed control enabling setup opportunities that would fail against opponents with adequate counterplay. The categorical thinking around setup sweepers encompasses both the sweepers themselves and the support structures that enable their success, creating layers of team-building considerations around single-species strategies. Wall breakers form a category designed specifically to eliminate defensive threats through overwhelming power or type effectiveness that defensive Pokémon cannot adequately counter. These Pokémon specialize in eliminating key defensive cores that might otherwise shut down offensive strategies, creating openings for teammates to sweep through weakened defensive lines. The wall breaker category exists primarily in relation to defensive categories, with their value determined by their effectiveness against prevalent defensive archetypes. This relational categorical thinking demonstrates how some categories only make sense in context of others, with their definition depending on what they counter, rather than inherent capabilities alone. Revenge killers form a category specialized in eliminating weakened opponents through high speed or priority moves before they can deal additional damage. Scarfed revenge killers sacrifice power or utility for guaranteed speed advantage that enables reliable elimination of threats that set up sweep. Priority revenge killers bypass speed concerns entirely through priority boosted moves that strike first regardless of relative speed stats. The revenge killing category serves essential defensive purposes despite offensive execution, enabling teams to recover from disadvantageous positions by trading relatively expendable team members for opponents' win conditions. Lead Pokemon categories organize around optimal first position species that set favorable conditions or establish early game advantages through hazards, screens, or momentum generating pivots. Suicide leads specialize in hazard setting or damage output before fainting, accepting their elimination as acceptable cost for achieved value. Defensive leads prioritize longevity and utility over immediate impact, remaining relevant throughout the battle rather than expending themselves early. Fast leads value immediate offensive pressure or hazard setup before opponents can establish their own field conditions. These lead categories demonstrate how positional role within battles creates specialized requirements distinct from general purpose team building considerations. Cleaner categories describe late game specialists that eliminate weakened opponent teams after teammates have applied sufficient pressure and damage. These Pokemon often have middling speed but high power, enabling them to eliminate low health survivors efficiently without requiring the speed necessary for early game impact. The cleaner category acknowledges that different stages of battles demand different capabilities, with late game cleanup requiring different traits than early game pressure or mid game grinding. This temporal categorical thinking adds sophistication to team building by considering how battles develop across multiple turns, rather than only focusing on initial configurations. Glue Pokemon form an informal category describing team members that enable overall team function through defensive presence or utility moves without necessarily serving as primary win conditions. These Pokemon check multiple common threats through favorable typing or bulk, creating breathing room for teammates to execute their primary strategies. The glue category demonstrates how some team members provide value through enabling others, rather than through individual offensive or defensive dominance, creating support roles that might not shine in usage statistics, but prove essential for team success. Win condition categories organize around specific Pokemon designated as primary paths to victory, with team construction focused on enabling these win conditions through support and removal of checks and counters. Teams might feature a single primary win condition with 5 support members or multiple win conditions that create adaptable paths to victory depending on opponent team composition. The categorical thinking around win conditions drives team building philosophy with clear understanding of how teams intend to win, guiding selection of supporting cast and strategic sequencing during battles. And in the quiet space between categories, where definitions blur and boundaries fade, there exists an acknowledgement that all classification systems serve understanding rather than defining truth. The categories make sense of overwhelming variety without claiming to capture complete essence of what each Pokemon represents to players who form bonds, create memories, and develop preferences that transcend mechanical optimization or competitive viability. Every category exists as a lens through which to view the franchise, useful for specific purposes while necessarily incomplete in its perspective. The categories persist because they help, because they create shared language that enables discussion and understanding across the vast community that has grown around these creatures. When someone mentions pseudo-legendaries, most dedicated players immediately understand the reference without requiring explicit enumeration of included species or detailed explanation of qualifying criteria. This shared vocabulary enables efficient communication that builds communities and facilitates knowledge transfer from experienced players to newcomers, still learning the elaborate systems that underpin competitive play and collection goals. The evolution of categories from official designations and community consensus demonstrates the collaborative nature of meaning-making around complex game systems. Some categories emerge from game mechanics, like baby Pokemon or legendary status, receiving official recognition and integration into game systems. Others arise purely from community observation and discussion, with pseudo-legendary and priority tiers existing entirely within player-generated frameworks. Both types of categories serve essential functions in organizing understanding and enabling sophisticated engagement with hundreds of species across multiple generations. The perpetual incompleteness of categorical systems ensures they remain dynamic rather than calcified, adapting to new generations and mechanical innovations rather than becoming rigid structures that constrain rather than enable understanding. Each new generation potentially introduces categories that require adjustment of existing frameworks or creation of entirely new organizational schemes. Paradox Pokémon demanded new categorical thinking when introduced, as did regional forms before them and Mega Evolution before that. This continuous evolution keeps categorical discussion alive and relevant, rather than becoming settled knowledge that requires no further examination or adaptation. Some Pokemon resist categorization through design choices that deliberately blur boundaries or occupy liminal spaces between established categories. These edge cases prove valuable precisely through their challenge to categorical thinking, forcing deeper consideration of what actually defines categories and whether specific traits truly matter for the purposes categories claim to serve. Arceus's type-changing ability across all 18 types makes it difficult to categorize by type, despite type being a foundational Pokemon characteristic. Ditto's transformation abilities create similar categorical uncertainty. These exceptions prevent categorical thinking from becoming too confident in its capacity to fully capture and classify all Pokemon. The gap between casual and competitive categorical thinking reveals different priorities and engagement levels that both exist validly within the same community. Casual players might never consider IV spreads, EV training, or ability tiers, while still enjoying Pokemon through collection, story progression, or aesthetic appreciation. Competitive players might view species primarily through their competitive utility and tier placement, engaging with game systems at levels of depth that casual players never access. These parallel categorical frameworks serve different needs without conflicting, demonstrating how the same content supports radically different engagement styles through the same underlying game systems. Children and adults engage with categories differently, with younger players typically focusing on favorite types, legendary status, or aesthetic preferences, while adult players might prioritize competitive viability, collection completion, or strategic depth. This age-based divergence in categorical priorities demonstrates how the franchise successfully serves multiple demographics simultaneously through layered systems that reward both simple engagement and complex mastery. The categories themselves shift in importance and meaning as players age, and their relationships with the franchise evolve across years or decades of engagement. The nostalgia category, while informal and deeply personal, might be among the most powerful for many players, organizing Pokemon based on emotional associations with first experiences rather than mechanical properties or strategic value. Generation 1 Pokemon carry nostalgic weight for players who entered the franchise during its earliest years, creating emotional significance that transcends competitive utility or design quality. Each generation creates new nostalgia categories for players whose first experiences occurred during those releases, building a franchise with multiple nostalgic entry points rather than a single privileged generation that holds emotional importance for everyone. Cultural categories emerge from how different regions and language groups interact with Pokemon designs, names, and mechanics, with certain species holding special significance as in specific markets. Pikachu's universal mascot status creates worldwide recognition that few other species achieve, while region-specific designs like the Kimono Girls or references to local folklore create deeper resonance in specific markets. The cultural layer of categorical thinking acknowledges that meaning and significance aren't universal properties, but emerge from interaction between content and specific audiences with specific backgrounds and associations. The merchandise category, while commercial rather than gameplay focused, creates its own hierarchies around which Pokemon receive plushies, figures, and promotional materials. This commercial prioritization reveals which species Game Freak and the Pokemon Company consider most marketable and valuable for brand expansion beyond games. The merchandise driven visibility creates feedback loops where popular Pokemon receive more promotional focus, reinforcing their prominence through exposure. This commercial layer of categorical thinking exists separately from competitive viability or design quality, driven purely by market considerations and brand management decisions. Anime prominence creates another media specific category where certain Pokemon gain recognition and character development through extensive screen time in animated series. Ash's Pikachu achieved iconic status through decades of anime appearances that game only players might not fully understand or appreciate. Team Rocket's Meowth gained character depth and recognition through anime focus that game mechanics alone could never provide. These anime prominent Pokemon exist in popular consciousness differently from game focused perception, creating divergent categorical understandings depending on whether players primarily engage through games or cross media exposure. Trading card game categories emerge from mechanical considerations specific to the TCG format rather than video game mechanics, with card rarity, deck archetypes, and format legality creating entirely separate categorical frameworks. The TCG's classification of certain Pokemon as GX, V, or VMAX creates power level categories that don't exist in games, while rule boxes and ancient traits implement mechanical categories unique to card-based gameplay. These parallel categorical systems demonstrate how Pokemon expands beyond single game systems into multimedia franchise with separate mechanical frameworks that each demand their own organizational structures. Mobile game categories, like Pokemon Go's Generations, raid bosses, and regional exclusives, create yet another set of location-specific and event-driven categories, serving that game's specific mechanical needs. The augmented reality gameplay and real-world location integration create categorical thinking around physical geography that mainline games simulate abstractly. Community Day species, research breakthrough encounters, and raid rotation calendars form temporal categories that matter intensely during their active periods before cycling out for new featured species. This mobile-specific categorization demonstrates how different gameplay platforms create platform-specific frameworks alongside franchise-wide categories that persist across all Pokemon media. The living Pokédex concept evolved from simple collection into a category of player achievement, representing extreme dedication and the organizational skill. Players maintaining living Pokédexes through generation transitions demonstrate commitment that exceeds casual collection goals, with the ongoing maintenance across new releases, becoming an identity and community membership marker. The living Pokédex category creates elite status within collecting communities, distinguishing those willing to invest hundreds of hours into complete collections from players satisfied with partial coverage or simple Pokédex registration without retention. Form collectors represent another specialized collecting category, pursuing every color variation, regional form, and alternate appearance within species capable of variation. This collection focus explodes the number of required specimens far beyond simple species counts, with species like Unown, Vivillon, or Alcremie demanding dozens of specimens each to achieve form completion. The form collecting category demonstrates how collection goals can escalate indefinitely through increasingly granular completion requirements, creating lifetime projects that might never achieve true completion as new generations introduce new forms for existing species. Shiny hunters form perhaps the most visible, specialized collecting category, with dedicated players streaming hundreds of hours pursuing specific shiny targets through breeding, soft resetting, or encounter chains. The shiny hunting community has developed elaborate methodologies, probability calculations, and support networks around pursuing rare color variations. The category encompasses different hunting specializations, with Masuda method breeders, soft reset hunters, and encounter chain specialists each focusing on different hunting approaches that suit their preferences and patience levels. This specialization within specialization demonstrates how deep categorical thinking can become when serving dedicated hobbyist communities. Competitive achievement categories organize around battle performance rather than collection, with ladder rankings, tournament placements, and win streaks creating hierarchies of competitive success. These performance categories exist in parallel with knowledge categories around strategic understanding and team building skill. The division between mechanical execution and strategic planning creates subcategories where some players excel at battle execution, while others specialize in team construction and metagame analysis. This specialization acknowledges that competitive success requires multiple skill sets that not all players possess equally, creating niches for different types of competitive engagement. Content creator categories emerge through social media and streaming platforms, with different creators specializing in competitive analysis, collection showcases, challenge runs, or casual playthroughs. These content-focused categories create communities around specific engagement styles and personality preferences, with viewers selecting creators whose approach matches their interests and values. The content creator ecosystem demonstrates how Pokemon engagement extends beyond direct play into parasocial observation and community participation through comment sections and Discord servers built around specific creators. The theory crafting category encompasses players who engage with Pokemon primarily through analysis and discussion rather than extensive gameplay, calculating damage spreads and optimal strategies, without necessarily climbing competitive ladders or completing extensive collection projects. These theory crafters provide analytical frameworks and strategic insights that enable others' competitive success, creating value through knowledge synthesis and communication rather than personal achievement. The category acknowledges that engagement with complex systems can occur primarily intellectually rather than through extensive hands-on execution, with both approaches creating valuable community contributions. And as categories proliferate and specialize, serving increasingly narrow communities and specific purposes, the reminder remains that these are all frameworks for engaging with childhood wonder transformed into systematic analysis, simple joy complicated by accumulated knowledge that both enriches and potentially obscures the immediate pleasure of encountering new creatures and exploring colorful worlds. The categories serve understanding without becoming the point, organize without restricting, and ultimately exist to enhance rather than replace the fundamental appeal that drew millions of players across decades to collect, battle, and care for these digital creatures that somehow became genuinely meaningful despite their fictional status and mechanical underpinnings. The categorical journey reveals as much about players as about Pokemon, demonstrating human tendencies toward organization, optimization, and mastery of complex systems. The elaborate categorical structures demonstrate both the depth that Game Freak embedded into seemingly simple creature collection games and the creative interpretation that communities bring to make sense of mechanical complexity through shared frameworks and collaborative knowledge building. Every category represents countless hours of play, discussion, and analysis that refined fuzzy initial impressions into precise technical understanding. The future holds more categories, yet unnamed, waiting in unreleased generations to create new organizational challenges and expand categorical frameworks in directions current players cannot anticipate. Generation 10 will introduce its own mechanical innovations, requiring new categories, while potentially retiring others that no longer serve current design philosophies. This ongoing categorical evolution ensures Pokemon never becomes fully known or completely mastered, always maintaining elements of surprise and discovery that preserve the wonder that first drew players to catch them all across nearly 3 decades of franchise history. And as the patterns finally rest, as the categories find their places in the vast network of understanding that spans species and generations and game mechanics and community practices, what remains is appreciation for the depth hidden within accessibility, complexity nestled inside simplicity, and the remarkable achievement of creating game systems rich enough to support this much categorical thinking while remaining fundamentally about the joy of discovery and the satisfaction of collection and the thrill of strategic competition among creatures that somehow transcend their ones and zeros to become genuinely beloved companions across millions of childhoods and beyond.